This is it! The ultimate dimension for rest and stories, and it's called Sleepy Myths.
It began quietly, as most strange things do. One moment, the garage was filled with the faint, familiar ticking of a dozen mismatched clocks. The next, everything stilled. The needles froze mid-motion. The pendulums hung like sleeping birds, and a silence so pure drifted through the air that it felt almost deliberate, like time itself had chosen to pause and take a breath. Rick didn't move at first. He only blinked slowly, the faint glow of his goggles casting a dim reflection in a half-finished flask. The silence pressed around him, not heavy but kind, the kind of stillness that follows snowfall or the first seconds after a song ends. The hum of his machines quieted, as if they too were listening. He tilted his head, squinting at the motionless second hand of the nearest clock. It pointed at 12, caught in perfect balance. "Well," he murmured, more to the air than to anyone, "that's new." The lamp above his workbench burned a soft amber. Dust motes floated lazily through its light, each grain suspended mid-descent. Even the faint breeze that usually slipped in through the cracked door had gone still. It was as if the entire garage had fallen into a single, infinite heartbeat, stretched, tender, unbroken. Morty shuffled in, rubbing his eyes, hair sticking out in uneven tufts. Grandpa? Why's everything stopped?" Rick didn't answer right away. He just leaned back on his stool, eyes half closed, as though trying to hear something beneath the quiet, some secret whisper, only the absence of sound could reveal. "Don't know yet," he said finally, voice low. "But it doesn't feel wrong, does it?" Morty frowned. "I mean, it's kinda creepy." Rick smiled faintly. "Creepy's just quiet with bad lighting, Morty." He gestured for the boy to sit. On the workbench lay a sandwich wrapped in paper, half-eaten, forgotten sometime between experiments. Rick tore it in two and handed the other half to Morty. The two sat together under the yellow lamp, chewing softly, the silence surrounding them like a warm blanket. The world outside might have frozen, but inside the garage it felt almost peaceful, as though this stillness had been waiting patiently for them to notice it. Morty swallowed a bite, glancing around. "You think time's broken again?" Rick shook his head. "No, if it were broken, we'd know. This—" He waved vaguely toward the motionless clocks. "This feels more like time just took a nap." Morty laughed a little, the sound small but bright against the quiet. Rick looked at him and thought for a fleeting moment how young laughter sounded, like something time couldn't quite touch. They ate in silence after that. The lamp hummed softly, a golden halo flickering over scattered tools and equations scrawled on walls. The smell of metal and old coffee hung in the air. Every so often, Rick's gaze wandered back to the frozen second hand, not in frustration, but curiosity. There was beauty in its stillness, perfection in pause. He stood, stretched, and reached for a small object half buried beneath blueprints, a strange hourglass, gold and glass intertwined in a delicate spiral. It wasn't one of his recent projects. It looked older, almost sentimental, a gift he couldn't remember receiving. Inside, fine grains of light shimmered faintly, like stardust caught in a jar. Morty leaned closer. "What's that?" "Something I made a long time ago," Rick said. "Or maybe something I found. Hard to tell." He turned the hourglass slowly, and for a brief second the grains seemed to move, not falling exactly, but gliding, as if deciding for themselves how to drift through the air. Then they froze again, mid-motion, their glow deepening to a warm, sleepy gold. Rick felt a strange calm settle in his chest. "Huh?" He set the hourglass down gently on the table. "Guess it likes the silence, too." They sat again. Morty watched the hourglass, fascinated. Rick reached for his flask but didn't drink. The stillness felt too delicate to disturb. The only sound was the faint crackle of the lamp filament and the quiet rustle of paper as a draft moved through the room. Soft, hesitant, almost apologetic. Outside the garage window, the night sky was motionless. The stars shimmered, but none twinkled. The moon hung suspended like a coin in water. Even the trees beyond the fence stood perfectly still, as if carved from time itself. Morty whispered, "It's like the universe is holding its breath." Rick nodded slowly. "Maybe it's just tired." Neither spoke after that. The silence grew tender, almost musical in its rhythm. Rick leaned back against the wall, closing his eyes. For the first time in what felt like centuries, his mind wasn't racing. Equations, regrets, memories, all of it softened, smoothed by the hush that filled every corner of the room. Morty finished his sandwich, brushed the crumbs from his lap, and watched his grandfather's face illuminated in the dim amber glow. He'd never seen Rick look so still, so human. "Grandpa?" he said softly. Rick didn't open his eyes. What if it stays like this? Then we make the most of it. How?" Rick smiled faintly, eyes still closed. "Start by listening." So they did. They listened to the faint buzz of the lamp, to their own breathing, to the subtle, unmeasurable rhythm beneath everything. Somewhere in that hush, the ticking of clocks returned, not loud or sudden, but distant, echoing from somewhere beyond the walls. It sounded slower now, more careful. Rick opened one eye, staring at the hourglass. The sand, if it was sand at all, had begun to fall again, glowing softly as it moved. Not fast, not slow, just steady. The silence didn't end. It merely learned to move. Rick exhaled. "Guess time woke up." Morty leaned his chin on his hand. "Do you think it dreams when it sleeps?" Rick thought about that, the question hovering between them like dust in the lamplight. He wanted to say no, but something about the golden shimmer in the hourglass made him hesitate. "Maybe," he said at last. "Maybe that's what stars are. Time's dream still burning." Morty smiled sleepily. The air felt thick with warmth, as though the room itself was sighing. Rick stood, adjusted the lamp, and dimmed it until only the hourglass glowed, a small sun of its own making. The garage looked softer now, almost cozy. Tools gleamed faintly, shadows stretched like tired ghosts, and the clocks resumed their gentle ticking, each beat landing like a heartbeat in the dark. Morty's eyes fluttered, heavy with drowsiness. "You think it'll happen again?" Rick glanced at the hourglass, its glow reflected in his eyes. "Maybe, but if it does, don't wake me." "Why not?" "Because," Rick murmured, settling back into his chair, "some silences aren't meant to be fixed." The lamp flickered once, then steadied. Outside, the stars shifted slightly, just enough to remind them the universe was still alive. Inside, the two of them sat in the quiet rhythm of clocks reborn, time breathing once more, softly, gently, as if grateful for the pause, and on the workbench, beneath the halo of fading light, the golden hourglass continued to glow, not with urgency, but with the tender patience of something eternal, waiting to be understood. The next morning didn't quite feel like morning. Light seeped through the dusty garage windows, at an angle that felt undecided, as if the sun itself wasn't sure whether it was rising or setting. The air was still thick with the hush from the night before. Even the dust in the beams of sunlight drifted slower, like they too remembered the silence and weren't ready to move too fast. Rick sat at his workbench again, the golden hourglass in front of him. The sand, if it could still be called that, glowed faintly with a lazy pulse, its rhythm neither steady nor random. It looked almost alive. Every few seconds, one grain would lift, shimmer mid-air, and then drift gently back down. Rick leaned closer, chin resting on his palm, eyes tracing the soft spirals inside. Morty wandered in, carrying 2 mugs of coffee, both steaming unevenly. He set one down beside his grandpa. "It's still doing that," he said quietly. Rick took the cup without looking away. "Yeah, and the clocks are fine now, aren't they?" "Yeah," Morty said. "Everything's ticking again, except this." Rick nudged the hourglass with a fingertip. It didn't topple. It didn't even tremble. The golden sand within kept drifting, slow and deliberate, like it was thinking. For a long time, neither spoke. The air smelled faintly of coffee and metal. A low hum came from one of the ceiling lights, the kind of sound that fills silence without quite breaking it. Finally, Morty said, "So, what is it?" Rick exhaled through his nose. "Something I made back when I still thought I could fix the universe by understanding it." He took a sip of coffee, wincing at the taste. "Turns out the universe doesn't like being understood." Morty sat on a stool opposite him. "You think it's dangerous?" Rick's lips twitched in a tired smile. "Everything's dangerous if you stare at it long enough." He reached for the hourglass, turned it upside down and waited. The golden sand hung mid-air for a heartbeat, then began to fall 1 grain at a time. But instead of hitting the bottom, each grain dissolved into light and reappeared above again, creating a soft loop of glow. A cycle without sound, Morty frowned. So it doesn't run out? Nope. Does it do anything? Rick's eyes softened. Maybe. Or maybe it just reminds us that not everything has to. He turned it again. The glow flickered once, brighter this time, and a subtle vibration filled the air. Not mechanical, not cosmic, just gentle, like the hum of remembered laughter. For a moment, Rick thought he heard something. A faint echo of voices, fragments of a conversation from another night. He couldn't place them, but they felt close, like déjà vu given sound. Morty looked around. Did you hear that? Rick didn't answer. He was staring at the hourglass. Thiacid's glow now spreading across the table like sunlight through water. The edges of his tools shimmered, outlines bending slightly as though the world were breathing. The hum deepened, then softened again. When it faded, the garage seemed unchanged except for the clock on the far wall. Its hands had moved backward by 3 minutes. Rick's brows furrowed. Well, he whispered, that's new. Morty leaned forward. You think it just turned back time? Rick shook his head. Not time, just feeling, Morty blinked. Feeling? Think about it, Rick said. We were just sitting here, calm, quiet, half asleep. The air felt heavy, soft. Maybe this thing doesn't rewind events. Maybe it rewinds moments, the mood, the breath between seconds. Morty looked around the garage. The sunlight through the window looked exactly as it had before. Same angle, same shimmer. But something had changed subtly. The air felt fresher. The fatigue behind his eyes had eased. Even his heartbeat felt slower, steadier, as if someone had given him a few more minutes of rest. Rick smiled faintly, almost proud, but not in the usual way. A pocket of endless minutes, he murmured. You feel it? Morty nodded, dazed. It's like... Time forgot to rush, Rick chuckled softly. Good. Maybe it'll teach us something. He placed the hourglass on a clear spot on the bench and reached for a small sensor pad, clipping it to the glass. No energy signature. No quantum spikes, no data, just a steady hum, like the quiet of a remembered lullaby. Try something, Rick said. Think about a moment that felt peaceful. Not big, not dramatic. Just something small you wish you could feel again. Morty hesitated. Then he closed his eyes. That night on the porch, he said. When it rained and we didn't talk. The light inside the hourglass deepened. The air filled with a faint scent of rain, clean, distant, dreamlike. A soft drizzle began to tap against the windows, though the sky outside was clear. Morty opened his eyes in wonder. Rick just smiled. There you go. The droplets faded after a minute, leaving the windows dry again. The smell lingered, delicate as memory. Rick sat back studying the golden device. It's not a machine, he murmured. It's a mirror. It listens, Morty frowned. Listens to what? To whatever we miss most. They spent the rest of the morning, if it was still morning, testing it gently. A joke Morty remembered made the air shimmer with faint laughter, as though invisible echoes bounced between the shelves. A sigh from Rick summoned a flicker of light that smelled faintly of old bourbon and pine. Each time they spoke softly, the hourglass responded, translating emotion into warmth and motion. When Morty laughed again, really laughed, a single grain of sand lifted and hovered between them. Rick reached out, let it settle on his fingertip. It was warm, not hot, not cold, just alive. He set it back down, and it rejoined the flow like it had never left. Hours passed, or maybe only minutes. Neither could tell anymore. The light in the garage never changed, caught in a perpetual early afternoon that felt like it could last forever. Rick eventually switched off his monitors, leaned back and simply watched the grains swirl. Morty sat cross-legged on the floor, tracing shapes in the thin layer of dust. The silence between them wasn't empty now. It was full of small, invisible things, the hum of contentment, the soft clink of glass, the ghost of their own breathing. After a while, Morty whispered, You think it could trap a feeling forever? Rick's eyes flicked to the hourglass. No, he said softly. It doesn't trap. It just lets you visit, Morty nodded. So, it's like time remembering to be kind. Rick smiled, the kind of smile that hides a little ache behind it. Yeah, something like that. Outside the air shimmered. A breeze picked up, carrying a faint scent of warm dust and sunlit metal. Inside, the hourglass glowed brighter, reflecting in the half-empty coffee cups. Morty yawned, his eyelids heavy. Feels like we've been here for days. Maybe we have, Rick murmured. Or maybe it's still the same minute, just taking its time. The hum softened again. The light dimmed. The last grains of golden sand slowed, almost still. Rick reached out, gently turned the hourglass over, and watched as the glow swirled upward once more. Quiet, infinite, unhurried. He didn't write notes or record data. He just sat there, breathing in the soft air of endless minutes, while Morty drifted into a half-sleep on the floor beside him. In the stillness, the clocks ticked slower again, not broken this time, just respectful, as though giving space to something sacred, and in the golden glow that filled the room, the world felt perfectly suspended, a tiny, eternal pocket of peace no one else would ever know existed. The next evening unfolded like a sigh. The garage was still filled with the soft pulse of half-finished experiments, lights breathing gently in the dark. The hourglass sat at the center of Rick's workbench, golden, faintly warm, humming like the memory of sunlight trapped in glass. Its glow no longer startled him. It felt familiar now, like the echo of a lullaby that had been playing in the background all along. Rick turned the hourglass once more. The grains didn't fall so much as float, suspended between heartbeats. The silence was deep, rich, and kind. Morty leaned against a pile of old metal scraps, watching his grandpa's reflection shimmer inside the glass. "Are we doing this again?" Morty asked quietly. Rick's answer was a small hum. "Not again, just—" Softer this time, the air shifted. The garage light dimmed. Then, in a blink, the walls dissolved into a slow, endless horizon. A planet Rick had once forgotten to name. It stretched outward in fields of tall, whispering grass, every blade glowing faintly blue like bioluminescent threads in a dream. The wind moved, but it made no sound. It brushed against them like a memory too gentle to disturb. "This place," Morty whispered. "Have we been here before?" Rick's boots crunched faintly in the soil that shimmered like glass dust. "Maybe? Maybe it's a place made from all the times we didn't notice we were happy." He bent down and touched the earth. It was warm. Beneath the surface, faint outlines shimmered, fragments of laughter, blurred silhouettes of moments replaying in silence. Morty knelt beside him and saw a version of himself running through the grass, younger, freer, holding something glowing in his hands. It wasn't an object, but a feeling, weightless, impossible to name. "What is this?" Rick tilted his head. "A memory garden. Every loop, every echo, every second we tried to hold on to grows here." They walked slowly through the field. Flowers bloomed where their footsteps landed. Not real flowers, but shifting shapes of remembered things. A cracked mug from the kitchen table, a sunrise seen once and forgotten, the sound of rain hitting the windshield on some nameless road. Each memory pulsed softly, alive for a moment before melting back into the ground. At the heart of the field stood an old diner. Its neon sign flickered in eternal twilight. Open 24 hours, though the clock above the door had no hands. The smell of coffee drifted through the air, sweet and faint. Morty pushed the door open. The bell above it chimed in slow motion, its sound stretching into a single warm note that never fully faded. Inside, time was syrup-thick. A jukebox glowed in the corner, playing a song that couldn't decide where it began. A waitress smiled from behind the counter, the kind of smile that felt like it had been waiting for them. They sat in a booth by the window. Outside, the horizon shimmered softly between dusk and dawn. "Feels like déjà vu," Morty said, stirring the coffee that refilled itself. Rick looked at his reflection in the cup. For a moment it wasn't him. It was a version from long ago laughing with someone unseen. He blinked and the image broke into ripples. "Maybe it is," he murmured. "Maybe memories keep looping until we learn to listen to them right." Morty leaned his chin against his hand. "You think time wants something?" Rick's eyes softened. Maybe it just wants to be remembered gently." They stayed in that booth for what might have been minutes or centuries. The hum of the jukebox folded into the ticking absence of the clock. Every few moments Rick would glance at the hourglass sitting between them on the table, its glow steady, patient, like it knew there was no rush. Morty's voice drifted through the stillness. "You ever think we're not supposed to fix everything?" Rick exhaled slowly. "Yeah, lately I've been thinking maybe some things fix us instead." He turned the hourglass slightly, and the diner window filled with stars. But they weren't moving. Each one hung perfectly still as if caught in the breath between seconds. The air shimmered faintly gold. Outside, The grass field began to bloom again, this time in slow waves of light spreading out toward the horizon. Morty watched them with wide eyes. "They're growing," Rick nodded. "Memories don't die. They just wait for you to come back." For a long time they said nothing. The silence between them was full, the kind of silence that holds every word you didn't have to say. Rick closed his eyes. He could feel the hum of the diner lights, the warmth of the coffee mug in his hands, the quiet presence of Morty beside him. The moment felt infinite, not in its length but in its gentleness. When he opened his eyes again, the booth across from them was no longer empty. Two faint outlines sat there, shadows of themselves laughing mid-conversation. Their voices were distant, echoing softly like a dream replaying itself for comfort. Morty didn't move. "Is that us?" "Could be," Rick said. "Or maybe it's who we were the first time we came here." The echoes faded as the field outside brightened into soft amber light. The world seemed to breathe again. Rick stood and placed a few coins on the table, though no one would ever count them. At the door, Morty looked back. The waitress was still smiling, her outlines shimmering faintly, dissolving into light. "Will we ever come back here?" Rick's expression was unreadable but gentle. "If time's kind enough," they stepped out. The diner faded behind them, swallowed by the memory field. In its place bloomed a new path, one lined with soft glowing sand that floated upward like reversed rain. Rick reached down and took a handful. The grains hummed, vibrating faintly against his skin. Each one pulsed with something familiar, a sound, a face, a feeling too quiet to name. He let the sand slip through his fingers. The wind caught it, carrying it upward toward the unmoving stars. Morty watched until the last spark vanished. "Feels like we're supposed to remember this." Rick smiled faintly. "We will, just not in order." As they walked, the horizon began to shimmer with colors that didn't belong to any hour, gold melting into violet, blue melting into silver. The air thickened with calm. The field behind them folded itself into stillness, like a page turning in a book that didn't need to end. For a moment, Morty thought he heard something, faint laughter, maybe, or the rustle of pages turning somewhere far away. Rick didn't react. He just looked up at the sky that was neither night nor day and whispered, almost to himself, "Time's not moving. It's remembering." The wind stilled. The light softened. The world for a heartbeat seemed to hold its breath, and in that pause everything felt endless. The loops had grown soft around the edges, as if time itself had begun to hum a lullaby. Each morning bled into the next like watercolor on paper. No beginning, no end, only the tender dissolve between them. Rick had stopped counting how many loops they'd lived. There was no reason to. He'd wake in the garage, always the same hour of quiet gold, the same warm flicker of the lamp, the same faint sound of the universe breathing through cracked glass. Somewhere in the background, the clock stood still, their silence glowing with patient kindness. Morty sat nearby most days, his head tilted against the back of a chair, his eyes half closed. Sometimes he read from an old manual Rick never finished. Sometimes he said nothing at all. Words had become gentle things, used sparingly like matches lit only to watch them fade. Rick turned the golden hourglass over again. The sand fell soundlessly, each grain slower than breath. When it emptied, the air seemed to sigh. Then, without a gesture, the moment began again. Morty blinking, Rick breathing, the same still hum of the lamp above. Except something was changing. The details no longer stayed where they belonged. The sandwich on the counter was a cup of coffee the next time. The hum of the lamp became the murmur of rain. The garage light flickered, and for a heartbeat Rick saw stars pressing against the ceiling like they were trying to get in. He didn't mind. The distortion felt peaceful. The lines between what was and what had been were fading, and in that blur there was relief. That evening, if it was evening at all, they sat on the hood of Rick's old ship parked outside. The air smelled faintly of dust and ozone. The sky wasn't dark or light, but something in between, an endless twilight stretched thin as silk. Stars blinked lazily like they were tired too. Morty leaned back and sighed. "Do you ever feel like we've done this before?" Rick gave a small smirk. "Kid, I've done everything before. The trick is to make it feel new every time." Morty laughed softly, then grew quiet. "It's weird, though. Sometimes I can't tell if this is the first time or the 100th. Rick's gaze drifted toward the horizon. if there even was one anymore. That's the point, Morty. Maybe time's not supposed to be a straight line. Maybe it's supposed to be a song you hum until it feels right. Morty thought about that, then smiled. So we're just humming the same verse over and over. Rick chuckled, low and tired but warm. Yeah, but every time you hum it, you mean it a little more. The sky shimmered faintly. The stars pulsed once like a heartbeat in the dark. The hum of the hourglass echoed faintly in their bones, though it was nowhere near them now. They sat in silence for a long while, the kind of silence that made you forget you were supposed to speak. Somewhere far away, the faint whisper of crickets blended with the cosmic wind. The world itself seemed half asleep, waiting for something neither of them could name. Then slowly Morty said, "Hey Rick, what if this never stops?" Rick didn't answer right away. He rubbed his thumb against the rim of his flask, though it was empty now. Finally he said, "Then we make it worth being stuck in." Morty turned to him, eyes soft. "How?" Rick looked up at the endless sky and shrugged. "By making forever beautiful." The words hung there, small but steady, like a candle flame refusing to die. For a moment, Morty couldn't tell if he'd heard them before. Maybe Rick had said them in another loop. Maybe in a dream. But they felt right, like something meant to be said again and again, each time with more gentleness than before. The world around them began to shimmer, edges folding in like paper soaked in light. The grass hummed faintly. The stars rippled and stretched, pulling closer until the sky itself seemed to breathe. The loops were no longer distinct. They blended, fused, danced together. Morty blinked and suddenly they were back in the garage, then in the diner, then standing in the golden fields, then sitting in silence beneath a sky that refused to move. Each place faded into the next like pages turning themselves. Rick didn't look surprised. He just smiled softly, the corner of his mouth lifting in quiet amusement. "Guess time's mixing its colors," he murmured. Morty reached out to touch the hourglass on the table. Its glow flickered, slower now, as if tired. "Rick, are we going to fade too?" Rick looked at him, then at the hourglass, then at the faint glimmer of starlight filtering through the garage window. His expression softened, not sadness, but something gentler. "Snus will just turn into whatever comes next." Morty blinked. "Like what?" "Like the pause before a song starts again." They both fell silent. Outside, the universe seemed to lean closer, listening. Rick stood and crossed to his workbench. For once, he didn't reach for his tools. He just placed his hand flat against the surface, feeling the faint hum of machines that had built and destroyed entire realities. Now they only hummed quietly, content, maybe even at peace. He turned back to Morty. "You ever notice, kid, that silence isn't empty?" Morty tilted his head. "What do you mean?" Rick gestured around them. "It's full of everything we didn't rush through. Every second we let breathe. That's what time really is. Not what we lose, but what we listen to." Morty smiled faintly. "You're getting kind of poetic, Rick." "Yeah," Rick muttered. "Don't tell anybody." They shared a small laugh, soft, tired, real. And in that moment the air shimmered again. The garage lights dimmed until everything was bathed in the golden glow of the hourglass. Rick and Morty stood in the middle of it, shadows stretching outward like fading brushstrokes. Rick looked toward the unseen horizon, toward every place they had looped and every memory they'd made, and said quietly, "If anyone's listening, you can rest now. We'll keep this moment safe." Morty didn't ask who he meant. He just nodded. The hourglass pulsed once, and the room filled with warmth. Not light, not sound, just a sense of stillness so deep it felt alive. Rick closed his eyes, and for the first time in as long as he could remember, there was no ticking, no buzzing, no waiting for the next crisis. Only the hush of something infinite and kind. Somewhere beyond, the loops folded into themselves, forming a soft spiral that seemed to whisper, "Before we begin again, let us rest." Rick exhaled slowly. The corners of his eyes softened. "Yeah," he murmured. "Let's rest a while." The hourglass gleamed once more, and then, for a long and perfect moment, nothing moved at all. The door appeared on a night that wasn't really a night, just an endless stretch of grey-blue light, neither dawn nor dusk. Morty noticed it first, a thin outline of brightness hovering behind Rick's workbench. It didn't belong to any machine, any invention, or any memory they could name. It was just there, waiting. Rick studied it for a long time, his brow furrowed not in confusion, but in quiet recognition. "You ever feel like you've been invited somewhere," he said, "but the invitation's been sitting unopened your whole life?" Morty shrugged, uneasy but curious. "Yeah, it's kinda," Rick smiled faintly. "Then I guess it's time we open it." He reached out, pressed his palm against the light, and the world folded inward, like paper curling around a secret. The garage dissolved into a soft hum, and before they could take another breath, they were standing in a place that felt both infinite and impossibly small. The library of unfinished days. Shelves stretched farther than sight, rows upon rows of translucent books, glowing faintly, their covers rippling like reflections on water. The air smelled faintly of old rain and candle smoke. Above them, stars hung from invisible threads, swaying gently as if the ceiling itself was the night sky remembering its stories. Each book hummed a low, delicate note. When Morty passed a hand near one, it whispered, not words but moments. A faint laugh, a gust of wind, a heartbeat slowing before sleep. Rick took a slow step forward, eyes tracing the shelves. "These aren't books," he said quietly. "They're time," Morty frowned. "Time," Rick nodded. "Moments that never got finished. Things people meant to say. Places they meant to stay longer. Silences they meant to keep softer." He ran a hand along one spine. It shimmered gold for a heartbeat, and Morty caught a flicker inside. A child watching snow fall through a cracked window. Just as he leaned closer, the image faded, swallowed by stillness. Morty exhaled. "That's kinda sad." Rick gave a small, tired laugh. "It's honest." They wandered through the aisles. Every shelf seemed to hum a different emotion: contentment, longing, regret, wonder. Some books floated slightly off their shelves, trembling as if waiting to be touched. Others were sealed shut, heavy with unspoken words. At one point, Morty stopped and picked up a thin, pale blue volume that vibrated softly against his palm. The title shimmered faintly before fading, A Morning When Nothing Hurt. He opened it carefully. Inside were just a few lines of light, images more than text. A quiet breakfast table, steam rising from a mug, the shadow of a bird gliding across the wall. Rick peered over his shoulder. "You write that?" Morty shook his head slowly. "I don't know, it just feels like something I should have." Rick smiled, faint and real. "Then maybe it's yours now." Morty placed the book gently back onto the shelf. The glow around it steadied, like a sigh finding its rhythm again. For a while, neither of them spoke. The only sound was the slow turning of invisible pages all around them, as though time itself were trying to catch up on its own reading. Finally, Rick broke the silence. "You ever think about how much of life we skip just by hurrying through it?" Morty looked at him. "You? Thinking about slowing down? That's new." Rick chuckled softly. "Yeah, well, loops change a man." They passed a section labeled Moments Left Unsaid. Rick hesitated there. The shelves glowed faintly blue, the air heavier, almost humid with memory. He reached for a volume marked only with a tiny spiral symbol. When he opened it, a voice whispered from within, not loud, not clear, but trembling with emotion. "You did your best." Rick froze. The whisper repeated, fading slightly. "You did your best." He shut the book quickly, jaw tight, but his eyes softened. Morty watched him, not asking. Just waiting. After a long pause, Rick said quietly, "Guess some moments finish themselves when you finally hear them." They moved on. In the center of the library stood a great clock with no hands. Its face was a pool of still water, reflecting the stars above. When they looked into it, the reflections shimmered into scenes. Beth running through a field of tall grass, Summer building a sandcastle that never washed away, a younger Rick holding a baby with the look of someone who doesn't yet know what time can take from him. The surface rippled, then stilled again. Morty whispered, "It's like the whole place is remembering for us." Rick nodded slowly. "Yeah, maybe time doesn't want to be fixed. Maybe it just wants to be remembered." They sat down near the edge of the reflection, the silence between them soft and companionable. Above, the stars swayed lazily. Somewhere deep in the library, a single book closed with a gentle click, like a heartbeat finding peace. Morty leaned back against the shelf, eyelids half drooping. "Rick, yeah? Do you think the books ever finish themselves?" Rick considered the question, staring into the motionless clock. Maybe, when someone finally stops trying to rush the ending, the air grew warmer, the glow around them dimming to gold. Somewhere, 1,000 unfinished moments exhaled at once, like a sigh shared across universes. Morty smiled faintly, eyes closing. "Feels nice here," Rick nodded. "Yeah, peaceful, huh?" For the first time, Rick didn't reach for a solution, a theory or a way out. He just sat. The faint hum of forgotten time wrapped around them, steady as a lullaby. He pulled a small notebook from his coat, a blank one still untouched. For a while he simply stared at it, the empty page catching the reflected starlight. Then, without overthinking, he wrote a single line, "A morning when nothing hurt." He left it open beside him, and when he looked up again, the shelves around them shimmered brighter. The unfinished moments sang softly, their voices blending into something tender and whole. The library didn't vanish, it simply grew quieter, as if satisfied that 2 small pieces of time had finally found their way home. Rick exhaled. "Guess that's enough reading for one night." Morty smiled, half asleep. "Yeah, just 1 more minute." Rick didn't move. "Take all the minutes you need, kid. We've got plenty left in this one." They stayed there, 2 quiet figures beneath the glow of unfinished days, until the stars dimmed and the silence grew thick enough to rest in. And as the last echo faded, the clock with no hands rippled once more, reflecting only stillness. They left the library of unfinished days behind them, though it never quite stopped echoing. Sometimes, as they drifted between places that may or may not have been real, Rick could still hear it, the faint rustle of pages, the heartbeat of memory turning itself over and over, whispering, "Stay a little longer." The hourglass hung quietly at Rick's belt now, no longer glowing. Its sand had grown pale, almost translucent, like frost clinging to glass. Morty asked once if it still worked. Rick said he didn't know, and for once, that was enough. They walked through what looked like a fragment of sky broken off and set down on the ground, an open plain where the air shimmered, blue one moment, golden the next. There were shapes in the distance, faint and rippling, as though memories themselves had learned how to stand upright. Morty shielded his eyes. "Is that people?" Rick squinted. "Looks like it." They moved closer and the air began to hum. The figures came into focus. Men, women, children, all faintly translucent as if they were made of fog and starlight. They weren't alive exactly. They were recordings, laughter carved into the world and left to repeat. It was then Rick heard it, his own voice, decades younger, carried on the wind. Not the weary drawl he'd grown used to, but a lighter tone, raw with wonder. Morty froze. "Rick, is that you?" Rick didn't answer. He just listened. The sound came from a small clearing ahead. There, beneath a suspended sun, a younger Rick sat at a table with a drink in his hand, laughing. A deep, careless laugh, the kind that didn't need to explain itself. Around him were blurred shapes, outlines of faces he must have known once but had long since forgotten. It was disorienting, watching himself without the weight of everything he'd become. The echo of his laughter rippled outward, soft but endless, like a melody that refused to fade. Morty glanced at him. "Man, you used to sound happy." Rick gave a small huff of breath. "Yeah, guess I was too dumb to know better." But the words came out softer than sarcasm, closer to regret than irony. They stood there for a while, watching the echo loop. The younger Rick would laugh, lift his drink, say something they couldn't quite hear, and then vanish for a second before reappearing again. The cycle was seamless, like a song trapped inside itself. Morty sat cross-legged in the grass, resting his chin on his knees. "What were you laughing about?" Rick frowned, trying to remember. He couldn't. The memory had become a shape without a story. Warm, familiar, but wordless. "I think it was something stupid," he said finally. "A joke, a tiny moment that meant nothing." Which is probably why it meant everything. Morty smiled faintly. "You miss him?" Rick looked at his younger self, the ghost of laughter bouncing against invisible walls. "I don't know if I miss him," he said. "But I miss how small life used to feel, when a good joke could hold the universe together for a while." The air shimmered again. The echo shifted. The younger Rick stood now, turning toward them, as if he could see through the veil. His expression was curious, not alarmed, not knowing, just quietly aware. "Rick," Morty whispered, "is he looking at us?" Rick's breath caught. The echo Rick smiled, a soft, unguarded smile, and for a moment the loop broke. He said something too faint to hear, and then his image flickered out. The silence that followed felt heavy, but not cruel. Rick sank down into the grass beside Morty, staring at the spot where the laughter had been. "Guess even echoes get tired," he murmured. Morty plucked at the grass. "Maybe he saw you." Rick's eyes stayed on the horizon. "Or maybe I just saw him the way I needed to." The wind moved gently through the air, carrying with it faint murmurs, other people's laughter, other lives half remembered. It filled the space like music too soft to dance to, yet impossible not to feel. Morty leaned back. "You know, I think it's kinda nice," he said. "That laughter can last longer than people." Rick chuckled quietly. "Yeah, the universe doesn't care about much, but it's got a soft spot for echoes." They stayed there until the light shifted again. The suspended sun flickered, turning silver, then dimming into dusk. The landscape rippled like water, and the distant laughter thinned into silence. Rick reached into his coat and pulled out the hourglass. The sand inside barely moved. It had almost forgotten how. He turned it over anyway, watching as a few stray grains drifted downward. Morty asked, "You think time's still looping?" Rick shook his head slowly. "Maybe it's resting. Or maybe it's just listening." Morty glanced at him. "Listening to what?" Rick tilted his head toward the fading sound around them. "Us?" They stood. The field shimmered one last time before folding inward, like a curtain closing on a play. In its place appeared a narrow bridge of light, leading into nothingness. Without speaking, they stepped onto it, their reflections trailing behind like soft ghosts. Each step felt lighter than the last. The silence wasn't empty. It was full of remembered sound, laughter that no longer needed a mouth to exist. Rick paused halfway across and looked back. "You know," he said, "for a guy who spent his life running from himself, it's weirdly comforting to find out I was worth chasing." Morty smiled faintly. "You were just lost, Rick." Rick's eyes softened. "Aren't we all?" The bridge pulsed underfoot, and for a brief moment the laughter returned, not loud, not complete, but enough. It threaded through the silence like sunlight through fog, gentle and forgiving. They reached the other side and found themselves standing beneath a sky made entirely of faint reflections. Every star flickered like a candle being remembered. Rick looked up at them, eyes bright with something that wasn't quite sadness. He said quietly, "Maybe that's what time really is, Morty. Just the universe remembering how it used to laugh." Morty nodded slowly. "Then I guess it remembers you pretty well." Rick smirked, but there was no arrogance in it, just warmth. "Maybe it remembers us." They stood there until the reflections began to fade, leaving only the slow rhythm of breathing and the faint ticking of distant clocks beginning to stir again. The sound was soft, gentle, as though time itself had decided to join the conversation. Rick exhaled, long and steady. "All right, kid. Let's see what's next." The bridge dissolved beneath their feet, and the world folded back into the quiet hum of the hourglass. For a moment, it almost sounded like laughter. There are skies that live and breathe, skies that shift, stretch and unravel their moods across the hours like curtains of color. But the one above Rick and Morty now was frozen. Not in time exactly, but in intention. The stars were caught mid-twinkle, locked in a glitter that refused to fade. The clouds were painted in stillness, their soft bellies brushed with the faintest glow of an unmoving dawn. There was no wind, no hum, not even the faint heartbeat of passing seconds. They stood in a field that felt both infinite and intimate. Each blade of grass gleamed faintly, as though aware of its own existence. The horizon didn't stretch, it simply was. Morty was the first to speak. "It's kind of beautiful," he said quietly, turning in a slow circle. "But it's weird, Rick. Nothing's moving." Rick's voice was softer than usual, a tone Morty had only heard in the moments between exhaustion and surrender. "This place is called the Still Sky," he murmured. "A place where time once came to rest after a long day." Morty frowned. "Time gets tired?" Rick smiled faintly. "Everything that moves eventually does." They began walking through the motionless light. Their footsteps didn't make sound. They left no trace behind. It was as if the world refused to acknowledge disturbance. Every color here had forgotten how to fade, every shadow how to shift, and yet, despite the stillness, there was a strange kind of peace, like standing inside a held breath that never needed to end. Morty ran his fingers through the air and felt something invisible shimmer against his skin. What is this place for? Rick looked up at the unmoving stars. It's what the universe made when it learned to pause. The first silence after the first sound, the echo that didn't echo back. Morty let the words sink in. You mean like the space between ticks of a clock? Rick nodded slowly. Yeah, the universe needs rest too. You can't keep spinning forever. They reached a ridge overlooking a valley that was so still it looked like glass. Down below, rivers hung mid-flow, their surfaces unmoving yet alive with faint color. The reflection of the frozen sky danced within them, a still dance, an eternal moment. Rick crouched and placed the hourglass on the ground. The sand inside hadn't moved since the last chapter of their journey. He turned it over, and for the first time one single grain trembled, then stopped again. Even this place, Rick said softly, has rules. It's where everything that's ever paused comes to rest. Unfinished songs, half-spoken confessions, stars that forgot how to die. Morty looked down at the valley. Is that why we're here? Because we forgot how to move? Rick didn't answer. A long silence passed, but it didn't feel empty. The world was full of subtle, soundless texture, the ghost of a breeze, the suggestion of distance. Then, faintly, a shape appeared on the far end of the valley. At first, it looked like a shadow stretching across the plain. But as it came closer, Morty realized it was a man, or at least what remained of one. He wasn't quite real. His form shimmered, flickering between outlines as though made of half-remembered motion. His steps didn't disturb the ground. Who is that? Morty whispered. Rick watched closely, eyes narrowing. That's Timekeeper Enon, he said finally. The first clockmaker. The one who built the pulse of the universe. The figure came to a stop before them. His voice was calm and deep, a resonance that didn't need sound to be heard. You've carried the hourglass long enough, he said, looking at Rick. You've seen what happens when time moves. Do you wish now to see what happens when it doesn't? Rick hesitated. For the first time since they began their journey, uncertainty flickered across his face. I've seen stillness before, he said. Usually at the bottom of a bottle. Enon smiled faintly. Then you've only seen its shadow. True stillness isn't the absence of motion. It's the understanding that motion was never needed. Morty looked from one to the other. What happens if we stay here? Fainan's eyes, ancient and patient, turned to him. Then you'll forget the difference between before and after. You'll live in the eternal now. Morty's heart tightened. And what happens if we leave? Then you'll carry this stillness with you, Enon said. Like a memory that hums behind every second. Rick studied the unmoving sky. For the first time he noticed how peaceful it felt. Not the kind of peace that begged to be broken, but the kind that made breaking unnecessary. Enon raised his hand. The valley below began to hum faintly. The rivers shimmered, trembling against their stillness. Every universe has a heartbeat, he said. This one has simply chosen not to beat for a while. Rick stepped forward. If it doesn't beat again, everything stops. Everything ends, Enon nodded. That may be mercy. The silence between them deepened, heavy with meaning. Rick looked at Morty, then at the frozen sky, then back at the unmoving hourglass. Maybe, Rick said slowly, the universe isn't asking for us to fix it. Maybe it's asking for us to listen. Enon's expression softened. You understand more than most. Rick knelt, picked up the hourglass, and held it between his palms. He didn't turn it over this time. Instead, he whispered, You can rest for a while. And for the first time, the sand began to move, not downward but upward, defying gravity, like time was exhaling instead of falling. The light in the sky flickered. One cloud trembled slightly, as if remembering motion. Enon smiled, his form beginning to dissolve into soft threads of light. Then the universe will breathe again, slowly. Morty watched as the man faded into the frozen air. Where did he go? Rick replied quietly, Nowhere. He just remembered how to stay. They stood for a while longer, watching the first star flicker, a single heartbeat in an otherwise still cosmos. It wasn't much, but it was enough. The silence that followed wasn't lifeless. It was sacred. Like the pause between two notes of a lullaby, Rick finally spoke. You know, kid, maybe this is what the end looks like. Not destruction, not collapse, just rest. Morty nodded slowly, eyes soft with understanding. Yeah, and maybe the universe dreams when it rests. Rick smiled faintly. Then let's hope it dreams of something better. They began walking again, the sky faintly stirring above them. It was subtle, a single wisp of cloud unfurling, the smallest ripple of color moving across the horizon. The world hadn't woken. It had simply learned how to breathe again. Behind them, the hourglass gleamed faintly before vanishing into the still air. And above them, for the first time in what could have been centuries or seconds, the stars began to move one by one. They blinked, soft, slow, deliberate, and time, with a sigh too quiet to hear, began to turn once more. The portal opened without sound. It didn't glow or shimmer. It simply unfolded, like a curtain drawn aside to reveal a quieter layer of reality. Rick and Morty stepped through and the air changed. It was warm, but not from heat. It was the warmth of memory, of things that once mattered and had chosen not to fade. All around them stretched an endless expanse of golden dust, rising and falling like a calm ocean. But this was no sand made of earth and stone. Every grain shimmered faintly from within, pulsing with soft, fragile light. Morty bent down and scooped a handful. The grains glowed between his fingers, humming with a sound too faint to be heard, only felt. "It's alive," he whispered. Rick knelt beside him, his expression unusually solemn. "Not alive," he said. "Remembered. These are moments, tiny ones. The ones the universe forgot to throw away." Morty let the sand run through his fingers. Each grain left a faint echo in his mind, a laugh, a sigh, a whisper of wind through grass. None of it lasted long, but each was achingly tender. "Moments?" Morty asked. "Like people's memories." Rick stood up and looked toward the horizon. "Not just people. Every consciousness that ever was. Every quiet second that didn't make it into the story. The universe keeps them here. It's like a sea of almosts." They began to walk. The sand shifted beneath their feet but made no sound. The only thing they could hear was the faint pulse of the dust itself, a heartbeat in slow motion. Above them, the sky was neither dark nor bright. It was the color of deep twilight, the kind that never decides whether it's dusk or dawn. Stars hung close, too close, their edges blurred, like reflections in a lake. As they walked, Morty noticed the patterns forming in the air, ribbons of golden dust swirling together, then fading apart again, like thought made visible. "What happens if you pick one up?" he asked. Rick didn't answer right away. He reached down, picked up a single shimmering grain and held it between his thumb and forefinger. It vibrated faintly like a held breath, and then quietly a voice echoed inside the air, "Daddy, look at me." Morty froze. He knew that voice. Or rather, he knew that Rick knew it. Rick's hand trembled slightly. The grain flared softly, showing an image. Beth as a little girl holding up a drawing, her eyes bright, waiting for him to notice. Rick didn't move. He didn't even blink, Morty swallowed. That's your memory, isn't it?" Rick's voice came out low, rough. "It's not a memory. It's a moment I didn't keep." The grain dimmed, then dissolved back into the sea, vanishing without a trace. Rick looked out across the dunes. "You think you lose time because of mistakes," he said quietly. "But you really lose it because you weren't paying attention when it mattered." Morty walked beside him, the dust glowing faintly under their steps. "So, all of this is just stuff people didn't notice?" Rick nodded. "Every kindness that went unremembered, every quiet morning, every thought that never turned into words." They walked in silence for a long time. The landscape didn't change, just waves and waves of glowing sand, humming softly, like the slow breathing of the cosmos. Eventually, they reached a rise, and from the top they saw what looked like a storm rolling across the sea of light. But the storm didn't rage, it shimmered. Millions of grains were rising together, forming patterns, constellations, fleeting shapes of people and creatures, and memories blending together in slow, graceful motion. Morty stared in awe. "It's like the stars are falling." Rick's eyes softened. "Or maybe we're walking inside one." He reached into his coat and pulled out the hourglass. The golden glow of the sand inside matched the glow of the dunes perfectly. It was as if it had been born here. He turned it slowly, watching the grains tumble down. Each one shimmered, each one alive with something unsaid. "I thought this thing was broken," he murmured. Maybe it was just waiting to come home. The sky shifted slightly. A faint wind passed through, soft like a sigh. The grains nearest to them lifted into the air, and began to drift upward, swirling lazily. Morty lay down on the dune and stared at the sky. "Hey, Rick, yeah? Do you think—" Every second we waste gets stored somewhere. Like even the boring ones. Rick sat down beside him. "Waste is a human word. The universe doesn't throw anything away. It just recycles it into something quieter." Morty smiled faintly, half asleep already. "That's kinda nice." Rick looked down at the boy, his breathing slow, calm. "Yeah," he said softly. "It is." He leaned back, staring at the frozen stars above them. He had spent most of his life chasing time, bending it, breaking it, mocking it. But now, lying here in the golden quiet, he felt something he hadn't in years. Stillness that didn't demand an explanation. He picked up another handful of sand. It glowed softly, the grains swirling against his palm. This time he didn't resist. He let them whisper. There was laughter, faint, rippling through him. Not Beth's this time. Not even Morty's. His own, younger, brighter, before everything turned heavy. He closed his eyes. The sound wasn't mocking or distant. It was warm, like a hand resting on his shoulder. Morty stirred beside him. "What are you hearing?" Rick exhaled slowly. "Just echoes. The kind that don't hurt anymore." They sat there until the dunes began to shimmer brighter, as if dawn were rising, though there was no sun to rise. The air filled with slow-moving light, the color of honey. Morty whispered, "It feels like the world's asleep." Rick nodded. "Maybe it is. Maybe we're walking through its dream." The hum grew softer now, fading into something like a lullaby sung by no one. The grains began to settle one by one, sinking back into the quiet sea. Rick brushed the last bit of sand from his hands and stood up. "Come on, Morty. Time's not going to stop remembering itself forever." Morty yawned and got to his feet. Where to next? Rick looked out at the endless horizon, where light met light and the world folded into itself. Forward. Or backward. Doesn't matter. It's all the same direction now. As they began to walk, the sand glowed faintly behind them, marking a trail of golden footprints. Slowly the wind rose and erased them, as though the universe itself was tucking them back into sleep. Above them, the stars began to shimmer again, not with motion but with memory. And in that still light, Rick whispered something no one else would ever hear. "Thank you." The wind carried the word away, folding it into the sea of moments, where it would glow quietly forever, just another grain of sand between stars. The garage was quieter than usual that night. The hum of machines had softened into something like breathing, steady and patient. Outside, the stars were low, drooping toward the horizon as if they, too, were growing tired. Rick sat at the workbench, elbows resting on the metal surface, staring at the golden hourglass that now seemed to glow of its own accord. Its sand shimmered faintly, like starlight seen through tears. He hadn't touched it in days. Morty sat across from him, sipping cocoa from a chipped mug. He watched his grandpa's face, the way his eyes moved but didn't see. Rick had that look, the one that meant he was thinking about everything all at once. "Hey," Morty said softly, breaking the stillness. "Can I try it?" Rick didn't answer at first. The question hung there between them, as fragile as the hourglass itself. Morty set his mug down, both hands around the warmth. "You said it doesn't rewind time, right?" "Just feelings. Moments you remember softly." Rick's gaze stayed on the glass. "Yeah," he murmured. "That's what it does. Or maybe that's what you do. The thing doesn't actually control time. It just listens to the parts of you that wish they could." Morty hesitated. "So, can I?" Rick looked up. His expression was unreadable for a moment, half curiosity, half something older, sadder. Then he slid the hourglass across the table, the glow catching the edge of his face. "Go ahead, kid." Morty touched it gently, afraid it might shatter. The glass was warm, and as his fingers brushed it, the sand inside slowed. It didn't stop. It just lingered, as if waiting for instruction. Rick leaned back in his chair. "Think of a moment you want to keep. Not something big, just something that still feels like home when you remember it." Morty thought for a long while. Then he smiled faintly. "That night on the roof, remember? When it rained and the power went out, and we just sat there talking about constellations that weren't even real." Rick's eyes softened. "Yeah, you spilled soda on my circuit board." Morty laughed quietly. "Yeah, you didn't even get mad. You just said it sounded like a good excuse to take a break." The hourglass pulsed once, then again. The light dimmed in the garage, fading into a deeper, slower hue. And suddenly they were there again. Rain tapped gently against metal. The sky was dark, but it glowed faintly with city light, like someone had smeared silver dust across the clouds. Rick and Morty sat side by side on the roof, wrapped in the smell of ozone and wet earth. Rick's hair was damp, sticking up at odd angles. Morty had his knees pulled up to his chest, chin resting between them. Between them sat the same hourglass, half buried in puddle water, its glow reflecting off the ripples. "It worked," Morty whispered. Rick nodded slowly. "You didn't bring us back. You just remembered us clearly enough that the world decided to agree with you." Morty looked around. "So it's not really time travel." Rick smirked faintly. "It's something better. You're not running from the past, you're sitting with it." They didn't talk for a while. The rain made small circles in the puddles, and the sound of it filled the silence perfectly. Morty glanced at Rick. "You know what's weird? When I think about all the stuff we've done, all the planets, the monsters, the timelines, none of it feels as real as this." Rick looked at the boy, then up at the sky. "That's because this wasn't about surviving or escaping. It was just being." Morty tilted his head. "Do you ever miss it?" Rick raised an eyebrow. "What, the chaos?" "No, the quiet," Rick chuckled softly. "You're the first person who's ever asked me that." Morty shrugged, looking out at the rain. "It's nice, you know. Just sitting here. Not saving anyone, not running. Just existing." Rick's voice turned low, almost tender. "Yeah, feels illegal, doesn't it?" Morty laughed, then sighed. The sound blended into the rain. "I think I could stay here forever." Rick looked down at the hourglass. The sand had stopped moving entirely now, frozen mid-fall. "Maybe you already are," he said quietly. "Maybe every version of you that ever wanted to rest gets to stay here." Morty looked at him, confused, but there was no fear in his face, just a kind of wonder. "So like some part of me doesn't move on?" Rick nodded slowly. "Yeah, but not in a sad way, more like the universe keeping your favorite parts safe." They sat that way for a long time, the roof humming beneath them, the rain whispering soft secrets. The air felt thick with memory, every drop of water a reflection of something kind. Eventually Morty leaned his head on Rick's shoulder. It wasn't something he'd ever done before, not even in their calmest moments. Rick didn't move. He just sat there, letting the boy rest. "Hey, Rick." "Yeah? Thanks. For letting me borrow time." Rick exhaled, the sound halfway between a sigh and a chuckle. "Wasn't mine to begin with." The hourglass flickered once, the golden light rippling through the rain. Slowly the world began to fade, the sound of water growing distant, the sky dissolving into a sleepy blur of stars. Morty blinked, and the garage returned around them. The hourglass sat still, sand settled, light dimmed. The cocoa in his mug was cold now. Rick stood and stretched, his back popping softly. "So, worth the trip?" Morty nodded, eyes glazed with that faraway calm. "Yeah, it's weird. It's like I didn't just relive it. I understood it this time." Rick smiled faintly. "That's the trick, kid. The second time you live something right is the first time you actually lived it." Morty laughed quietly. "That sounds like something you'd put on a coffee mug." Rick shrugged. "Maybe I should start a line. Existential swag." The boy grinned, then grew serious again. "Do you ever use it, Rick? For yourself?" Rick turned toward the workbench, hands in his coat pockets. "I used to, but lately I think I'd rather make new moments than chase the old ones." Morty nodded, though his eyes lingered on the hourglass. "Can I keep it for a while?" Rick paused, then nodded. "It's your hour now." Morty picked it up carefully. The glass felt heavier, as though it now carried something inside it, a warmth that wasn't there before. He placed it on the shelf beside the cocoa mug. As he did, the faintest hum filled the air, barely perceptible but undeniably there, a soft echo of rain, laughter and quiet belonging. Rick switched off the main light, leaving only the faint golden glow of the hourglass behind. "Night, Morty." "Night, Rick." Rick hesitated at the door. "Hey, kid." "Yeah." "You did good with it." Morty smiled, already half asleep in his chair. "Yeah." It felt good. The hum deepened, becoming a lullaby that neither of them could place, but both remembered somehow. And as Morty drifted into sleep, the last thing he saw was the hourglass glowing softly, steady, patient, infinite. For 1 hour, and maybe forever, time didn't move at all. It just breathed quietly between them. They arrived at the edge of nowhere. No portal hum, no swirling lights, just the slow unspooling of one reality into another, like a thread being pulled from the sleeve of time itself. The world they stepped into was dark but not empty. It glimmered faintly, as though starlight had been scattered across the floor. Ahead stood the observatory. A vast dome of glass and brass and quiet breath anchored in the middle of an ocean that did not move. The water reflected nothing. It absorbed everything. And somewhere inside that silence, the stars seemed to be watching back. Morty shivered. "You sure this place is safe?" Rick's voice was soft, almost reverent. "Safe doesn't matter here. This place doesn't do danger or safety. It just shows you what could have been." Morty frowned. "Like alternate timelines?" Rick shook his head. "No, not the ones that were. The ones that wanted to be." He walked forward, his boots making no sound on the obsidian ground. The door opened without being touched, sighing like an old breath finally exhaled. Inside, the air was cool and golden. The walls of the dome were lined with mirrors, the thousands of them, all turning slowly, reflecting slivers of half-seen moments. Some showed empty fields, some showed faces that never aged, some just glowed faintly, as if the memory of a candle had been trapped inside. At the center stood a single telescope. It was enormous, carved from a material that shimmered between metal and cloud. It faced upward, into a sky that wasn't there, just the endless fabric of what might have been. Rick approached it without a word. Morty lingered a few steps behind, the mirrors catching his reflection in endless variations. In one he was older, in another younger, freer. In yet another he was gone entirely. "Rick," he whispered, "what do you see in here?" Rick ran a hand along the telescope's rim, his fingers leaving faint trails of light. "Everything you didn't choose," he said softly. "Every door you never opened, every word you didn't say." He looked through the eyepiece. The light that met his eye wasn't light at all. It was memory. It shimmered, wavered, and began to take shape. Morty stepped closer. "What is it?" Rick didn't answer right away. Through the lens, he saw a different version of his garage, brighter, quieter. Beth was there, older now, smiling as she held a small child. Not Morty, someone else. The air was warm with the kind of laughter that doesn't need to be clever to feel real. Rick's throat tightened. He pulled away, blinking. "It's nothing. Just noise," Morty frowned. It didn't look like nothing. Rick turned toward another mirror instead. In it, he saw himself teaching. A classroom, students laughing, not from fear but understanding. His hand trembled slightly, then fell to his side. Morty stood beside him, looking at his own reflection. He saw a version of himself still running from adventure to adventure, face thinner, eyes sharper, smile gone. Another reflection showed him older, sitting in a quiet house surrounded by plants and books, his hands steady. He exhaled. "It's weird. It's like looking at ghosts that never got born." Rick nodded. "Yeah, that's all futures really are, unborn ghosts." They wandered deeper into the observatory. The mirrors thinned until only the vast dome of glass surrounded them, and above the stars began to move, not fast, not frantic, but in slow spirals, as if rearranging themselves. A low hum filled the air. The telescope turned on its own, aligning with a constellation that looked vaguely familiar, a crooked line, like an outstretched hand. Rick adjusted the lens again, this time inviting Morty closer. "Go ahead," he said quietly. "Look." Morty pressed his eye to the glass. At first, all he saw was darkness. Then the darkness began to breathe. Shapes formed, vague at first, then clearer. He saw himself standing outside a small cafe. Inside sat his family, Mom, Dad, Summer, even Rick. They were laughing, eating breakfast, sunlight on their faces. "No portal guns, no universe-ending threats. Just peace," he whispered. "It's dice," Rick's voice came low. "It's what you think you'd want." Morty pulled back, confused. "What do you mean?" Rick leaned against the telescope, his eyes tired but kind. "Every possible version of you exists somewhere, kid. But that doesn't mean they're better. Most of them aren't happy. They're just edited, simplified. They only look peaceful because you're seeing them through wishful eyes." Morty thought about that, then looked again, and this time he saw the same scene slightly differently. The laughter was thin, the sunlight a little too still. There was no adventure, no spark, just repetition. The stillness was heavy, not peaceful. He stepped back. "I get it," he said softly. "It's not real. It's just comfortable." Rick nodded. "Yeah, comfort's easy to confuse with meaning." They stood there for a long time, watching the slow dance of stars above the dome. The hum of the telescope faded until it was just a heartbeat in the distance. Finally, Morty turned toward him. "Do you ever look for your best version, like the one where you did everything right?" Rick smiled faintly, the kind of smile that carries more ache than joy. "You don't find those versions here," he said. "For you forgive them." He looked through the telescope one last time, but instead of turning it toward another false sky, he turned it down, toward the ocean of black below, and there, faintly glowing, were tiny lights rising from the surface. Not futures, not dreams, just memories, a small unfinished reel. "See that?" he whispered. "That's everything I actually lived. Not perfect, but mine." Morty stared. The little lights pulsed softly like living stars, a map of moments that didn't need to be more than what they were. "Why is it beautiful?" Morty asked. Rick looked at him. "Because it happened." They didn't move after that. The observatory began to fade around them, its walls dissolving into mist, the mirrors folding into the dark. The telescope melted into the air, becoming just another breath of time. The ocean beneath them reflected their faces for a brief second, one old, one young, both caught between what was and what might still be. Then the vision dissolved. The garage returned, humming gently in the half-light. The hourglass sat on the bench again, steady and golden, as if it had been waiting the whole time. Morty looked at Rick. "Did we just dream all that?" Rick adjusted his coat. "Maybe. Or maybe we just looked at the parts of ourselves we don't visit enough." Morty smiled faintly. "Kinda makes you want to slow down, huh?" Rick chuckled. "Kid, slowing down might be the only adventure we haven't ruined yet." They shared a quiet laugh, small but honest. Outside, the night stretched wide and endless. Stars shimmered above the garage roof, and for once, neither of them felt the need to go anywhere at all. And somewhere far beyond, the observatory stood empty, its mirrors gone dark. But if you listened closely, you could still hear the faintest whisper of its truth drifting through space. The future isn't ahead of you. It's inside the seconds you're gentle with. The night had grown tired. Not dark, not quiet, just heavy with the kind of stillness that comes when even time forgets to keep track. The world outside the garage was wrapped in soft fog, and the sound of rain was so gentle it seemed more imagined than real. Rick sat at his workbench, not working. A mug of coffee cooled beside him, untouched, steam rising like a ghost that hadn't decided whether to stay or drift away. Morty was asleep in the corner, curled up on a pile of old blankets, breathing slow and even. Rick stared into the cup. The surface of the coffee shimmered faintly, too faintly. He frowned, leaned closer, and saw that the liquid wasn't reflecting the room anymore. It was moving, slowly like a horizon turning beneath an invisible sun. He muttered, "Oh, for fu—" Before he could finish, the cup pulsed once, softly, and the world folded inward. There was no flash, no warning, just the subtle feeling of falling, the same way one falls into thought. The workshop dissolved into vapor, and when the air settled, Rick was sitting at a small cafe table. The same cup sat before him, full, steaming, but the place around him was endless. The cafe stretched outward infinitely, tables fading into soft gold haze. The air smelled like cinnamon and old rain. Jazz music drifted lazily through the room, but there were no speakers. The sound came from somewhere between the seconds. A waitress approached. Not human, not alien, just the idea of warmth made visible. Her outline shimmered like morning light through a curtain. "Coffee?" she asked gently. Rick blinked. "I mean, yeah, but I didn't order—" She poured without answering. The cup refilled itself endlessly, a stream of dark, fragrant time spiraling into the mug without overflowing. Rick stared at it. "Okay, either I'm dead or I've finally brewed consciousness." From across the cafe, a voice replied, "Neither. You're just tired." Rick looked up. At a table near the window, though there was no window, only a soft horizon where rain and stars mixed, sat another man. Gray hair, sharp eyes, same lab coat. Rick's own face, a little older, maybe kinder. "Really?" Rick muttered. "Multiverse déjà vu?" "This again?" The other Rick smiled faintly. Not exactly. You could say I'm one of your quieter conclusions. Rick slouched back, unimpressed. Great. I've finally gone so far in I've looped back to my own therapy session. The older version chuckled. If that's what you want to call it. Though here, therapy's just a different way of saying pause. Rick glanced around. The cafe didn't move, but the people, or shapes, within it seemed to shimmer between identities. Some looked human, others like constellations wrapped in coats. Every table carried the same thing, a cup of coffee that never cooled. What is this place? He asked. The older version leaned forward. It's where travelers come when they've run out of destinations. Rick smirked. Cute. You sound like a fortune cookie I wrote drunk. Maybe you did. They sat in silence for a moment. Rick took a sip. The taste was strange, warm but infinite, like drinking a moment stretched across eternity. The caffeine didn't kick in. Instead, it softened something behind his ribs. You ever notice, the older Rick said, how every universe smells different, but every cup of coffee smells the same? Rick eyed him. You mean chemically or philosophically? Both. It's the only constant that doesn't care what version of you is drinking it. Rick chuckled softly. So what? This is your grand metaphor for stability. No, said the older one. It's a reminder that even chaos gets tired. That line hung in the air like a sigh. Morty's voice suddenly echoed faintly, distant, like through water. Rick, you okay? Rick looked toward the sound, but the cafe blurred, its edges softening. The waitress passed again, placing a small hourglass on the table between them. The sand inside was made of light, each grain falling at a different speed. What's this? Rick asked. Your refills are almost up, she said gently. Time doesn't pause forever, even here. The older Rick smiled. You hear that? You're running out of stillness. Always were, Rick frowned. You're not real, are you? The older version tilted his head. Define real. I'm every moment you ever almost rested. I'm what your neurons build when they need silence. Rick looked down. The coffee in his cup was no longer dark. It had turned to stars swirling in slow spirals. He whispered, That's beautiful. Yeah, said the older Rick, but you can't stay here. Beauty gets dull if you never leave it. The waitress returned, holding a small note. It wasn't paper, but memory, glowing faintly in her hands. She handed it to Rick with a smile. He unfolded it. The words shifted until they settled into legibility. The best universes aren't found. They're shared. Rick stared at it for a long time. Then he looked up. The older Rick was gone. The cafe was empty now, save for faint figures fading into the mist. The music grew softer, then stopped. He took one last sip of the starry coffee. It tasted like forgiveness. The cup emptied and the world folded back. The sound of the garage returned first. The rain, the faint buzz of machinery, the quiet hum of life that never quite sleeps. Rick blinked. The mug was still in his hand, half full. The coffee looked normal now. Morty stirred in his corner. You were talking in your sleep, he mumbled. Rick rubbed his eyes. Yeah, what did I say? Morty yawned. Something about caffeine in the cosmos and, that you should have ordered decaf. Rick chuckled softly. Maybe I should have. He set the cup down and stared at it. The surface was still again. No stars, no ripples, just reflection. His own tired eyes looked back. He whispered, Even chaos gets tired. Morty blinked awake, stretching. Huh? Nothing, kid. Go back to sleep, Morty did. Within minutes his breathing was steady again. Rick sat there for a long time, watching the rain bead on the window, each drop catching the faint light of the hourglass nearby. When he finally picked up the mug, it was cold. But he smiled anyway and took one last sip. Outside, dawn was trying to find its way through the fog. Inside, the silence was soft enough to breathe in. For once, Rick didn't fight it, he just sat there, still, unguarded, a scientist in a quiet universe that for a fleeting hour had stopped asking for answers, and somewhere beyond the stars, in that endless cafe of forgotten travelers, a single empty cup shimmered for a moment, then faded, not gone. Just waiting for the next weary mind who needed to rest inside infinity. The morning came in pieces, a slow spill of light over metal, a hum beneath the floor, a whisper in the glass. The clocks were still asleep, their hands hovering in the space between seconds as if reluctant to wake. Rick sat with his head bowed over his workbench, surrounded by the smell of solder and the faint, comforting static of memory. He had been building something again. Not out of ambition this time, but out of ache. The kind that sits quietly in your chest until your hands start moving on their own, searching for gentleness in circuitry. The device was small, a palm-sized sphere of silver and glass, glowing with the faintest warmth. It looked like something between a seed and a heart. Morty leaned over his shoulder, blinking the sleep from his eyes. "What's that, Rick?" he asked softly. Rick didn't look up. "A reminder. Of what?" He hesitated, turning the sphere in his hands. The faint hum it gave off almost sounded like breathing. "Of how words can outlast everything else if they're kind enough," Morty frowned. "You mean like nice words?" Rick half smiled. "Yeah, the nice ones that actually mean something. The ones people forget to say until it's too late." He pressed a small button on the device. It flickered, emitting a low tone that wrapped the room in something like stillness. Then a voice, faint, almost shy, whispered from within, "Thank you." Morty blinked. "What the? Who said that?" Rick shrugged. "Doesn't matter. It's just the last gentle thing someone said near here. It stores them." He looked down at the glowing sphere again. "Every kind word has a frequency. Most folks never hear it, but it's there, in the walls, the air, the dust. This little thing just listens." Morty stared at it, wide-eyed. "So it can, replay every nice thing people ever said?" "Not every," Rick said, voice soft. "Just the ones that mattered." For a long while they didn't speak. The hum of the machine deepened, low and steady, like the heartbeat of something small but alive. The air in the garage felt different, gentler, warmer. Morty leaned back on a stool. "You think it'd, ever say something you said?" Rick didn't answer. His eyes were distant, fixed on the glow. He turned a dial on the side and the tone shifted, higher, clearer. The air shimmered faintly like heat over sand. Then came another voice. This one older, softer, cracked by time. "It's okay, Rick, you did your best." Morty looked up sharply. "Who was that?" Rick didn't move. His throat worked once before he spoke. "My mom," he said quietly. "I think." The words hung there like fragile glass. He didn't look at Morty, didn't move, didn't breathe for a few seconds more. The glow of the machine pulsed, 1, 2, 3 heartbeats, before fading back to its resting hum. Morty swallowed hard. "Does it hurt hearing that?" Rick exhaled, a sound between a laugh and a sigh. "Yeah, but it's a good kind of hurt." They sat in silence again. Outside, the rain had stopped, but droplets still clung to the window, turning the light into small galaxies. Morty reached toward the machine. "Can I try?" Rick nodded, sliding it over. "Careful with the tuning." "It's touchy." Morty turned the dial slowly. The light flickered blue, then gold. A new voice emerged, faint, trembling, but unmistakably warm. "Proud of you, Morty." He froze. The voice was his mother's. He recognized the rhythm instantly, the way she always said proud like it was heavier than it sounded. Rick glanced sideways. Morty was staring at the machine, unmoving. His lip trembled. "She never said it like that," Morty whispered. Not out loud." Rick nodded slowly. "Yeah, but sometimes we hear what we needed, not just what was said." The light faded. The garage grew quiet again, the air still buzzing faintly from the echoes of kindness. Morty brushed his eyes and chuckled weakly. "This thing's dangerous, Rick. Makes you feel stuff." Rick gave a low laugh. "Yeah, I might have accidentally built empathy. Don't tell anyone." He set the sphere aside, wiping a bit of dust from its surface, as if the act itself was sacred. "You know," he said after a while, "I spent most of my life chasing noise. The loud kind, explosions, engines, theories. Thought it meant I was alive." Morty looked at him, waiting. "But this," Rick continued softly, nodding toward the machine, "this is the first thing I've built that doesn't want anything from me. It just listens." The hum of the device filled the pause, steady and patient. Morty leaned on the table. "Maybe that's what being alive actually is." Rick arched an eyebrow. "What, listening?" "Yeah," Morty said, "like, when you listen to someone, you're kind of holding time still for them. You're saying, hey, you exist. I hear you." Rick blinked slowly, his gaze settling on Morty as though seeing him anew. He didn't speak. Instead, he reached out and turned the dial once more. The machine glowed brighter than before, gold like dawn, soft like breath. Dozens of whispers overlapped, distant but close, old but familiar. "You matter." I love you. Thank you. It's okay. The words layered over one another until they became something beyond language, a lullaby made of gratitude and memory. Morty closed his eyes. It's like all the nice things people forgot to remember, Rick nodded. Yeah, maybe the universe keeps them safe. The light dimmed again, slowly, as though reluctant to leave. After a while, Rick took the device and set it on a shelf near the hourglass. The two glows pulsed together for a moment, gold and white like twin heartbeats syncing. He turned back to Morty, his voice barely above a whisper. You know, if anyone ever invents a machine that replays all the unkind things people said, I hope it never works. Morty chuckled. Yeah, that'd be too loud. Rick smiled faintly, the kind of smile that came from somewhere deep and unguarded. Exactly. He flicked off the lights, leaving only the soft glow of the devices, one measuring time, the other remembering kindness. Together they filled the room with a hum so gentle it could almost be mistaken for silence. Morty yawned, pulling his blanket closer. Night, Rick. Rick paused, hand on the switch. Night, kid. He hesitated, then added quietly, You did good today. Morty, already half asleep, smiled into his blanket. Thanks. Rick stood there for a long moment, the faint shimmer of the machine lighting the tired lines on his face. The air was warm, still kind. Somewhere deep inside the silver sphere, a new whisper etched itself into the current of memory. Soft, almost too faint to hear. Thanks, Rick. He froze, then exhaled, a slow, quiet breath that trembled on its way out. Yeah, he murmured. Any time. And as the garage sank into stillness, the machines hummed on, carrying kindness through the quiet, looping it softly through the night. There came a morning when even the light seemed to forget how to rise. It slipped into the garage slowly, not as dawn but as memory. Gold diluted into grey, stretching across the floor in hesitant silence. The air carried the scent of oil and dust, and somewhere faintly the sound of a clock ticked, or maybe it was only pretending to. Rick sat at his desk, half asleep, his head resting on folded arms. Around him everything looked exactly as it always had. Blueprints pinned to walls, tools scattered like constellations, the hum of forgotten inventions breathing in unison. Morty stirred nearby, rubbing his eyes and yawning into the dim quiet. He looked around and frowned. Rick, did we already do this? Rick didn't lift his head. Yeah, Morty, we've done this. About 36 times, Morty blinked. Wait, you mean we're looping again? Rick's voice was low, steady, a little too calm. Loop 37. Give or take? Hard to tell anymore. The hourglass keeps resetting everything that matters, or maybe everything that doesn't. Morty sat down beside him, squinting at the faint glow of the hourglass on the table. Its sand shimmered faintly, falling upward and downward at once. Doesn't it bother you? Morty asked after a moment. Rick opened one eye. What, it being trapped in endless calm? Not really. Beats existential chaos. But it's the same every day, Morty said. The same rain. The same breakfast. The same light coming through the same crack in the blinds. Don't you ever want it to change? Rick stared at the hourglass. I used to. But then I realized the only thing that ever really changes is how you feel about the sameness. He stood and crossed to the counter, pouring coffee into a cracked mug. The sound of the pour was soft, rhythmic, a ritual more than a necessity. He took a sip and sighed, not from weariness but from some quiet recognition. Morty sat on the floor, knees drawn up, staring at the machines blinking softly in their eternal sequence. It's weird, he said. At first I thought I'd go crazy doing the same things again and again. But now it's kind of peaceful. Rick smiled faintly. See? Entropy's a slow sedative. Morty tilted his head. You think time gets tired too? Rick looked over his shoulder, eyes distant. Oh, it's exhausted. Been dragging itself forward for billions of years. It deserves a nap. The rain began to fall outside again, and soft, predictable, rhythmic. The kind of rain that knew exactly when to arrive and when to fade. They had heard this rain before. Every note, every pause between drops. Morty wandered toward the window. The world beyond it was suspended in golden haze. The same sky, the same glimmering puddles, the same faint reflection of stars that shouldn't be visible at this hour. Do you ever wonder, Morty said softly, if we're the ones being repeated, not time? Rick chuckled under his breath. You're starting to sound like me. That's how I know the loop's getting deep. But his voice wasn't mocking, it was proud. He joined Morty by the window. Together they stood in that still world, two figures outlined by pale light. The reflections moved slightly in the glass, not enough to be different, just enough to remind them that they were still there. Rick took another sip of coffee. "You know what I've realized, kid? Every loop gets quieter." Morty looked up. "Quieter?" "Yeah, fewer words, fewer thoughts. It's like time's sanding down the noise. What's left are just the soft edges, the good ones." Morty smiled faintly. "Like what?" Rick thought for a long while before answering. "Like this, standing here just existing next to someone who isn't trying to fix you." The rain's rhythm deepened. The hourglass pulsed faintly on the desk, each grain of light suspended mid-fall for longer than the last. They stayed there for what could have been minutes or centuries. Eventually, Morty said, "Do you think the loop will ever stop?" Rick shrugged. "Everything stops eventually, even forever." Morty turned to him. "And when it does?" Rick smiled without looking. "Then we'll finally know what comes after stillness." A faint laugh escaped Morty. "You sound okay with that." "Maybe I am," Rick said. "I've been running from endings my whole life. Turns out they're just beginnings wearing quieter clothes." He returned to his workbench, hands moving automatically, adjusting a wire here, tightening a bolt there. The machine before him wasn't anything new. It was the same device he'd built in every loop, a nameless contraption that hummed softly and never quite finished itself. But this time, something felt different. He worked slower, more gently, as though afraid to wake it. Morty watched him. "You know, Rick, maybe the point isn't to escape the loop. Maybe it's to learn how to rest inside it." Rick looked up. Their eyes met. He nodded once, almost imperceptibly. "Maybe you're finally smarter than I am." Morty grinned. "Nah, just sleepier." The rain eased. The garage felt warm again. The kind of warmth that doesn't come from heaters or engines, but from presence. Rick leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling. "You ever think about what would happen if time just forgot to start again?" Morty shrugged. "Maybe it already did. Maybe we're the dream it's having." Rick chuckled softly. "You're getting poetic, kid." "Dangerous territory," Morty laughed. "Guess loops make poets out of people." They fell quiet once more. The air smelled faintly of solder and rain. Somewhere deep in the walls a loose wire buzzed, keeping rhythm with their breaths. Rick reached for the hourglass and turned it slowly. The grains glowed, then froze halfway down. Morty watched in awe. "You stopped it?" Rick shook his head. "No, it stopped itself." The two stared at the suspended light, a golden trail frozen between what was and what might be. "Loop 37, Rick murmured. "And maybe the last." Morty didn't answer. He just leaned his head against Rick's shoulder, half asleep. The silence between them was enormous, but not empty. It was full of everything they'd said, and all the things they didn't need to. Rick rested his hand on the hourglass. "You feel that?" Morty murmured, eyes closed. "What?" "The world breathing slower." And indeed it was, every sound stretching, every light dimming, every thought softening at the edges. The loop wasn't breaking or ending. It was resting, just like them. Rick looked at the frozen sand, the golden grains suspended mid-air. He smiled faintly, his reflection small in the glass. "If this is what forever feels like," he whispered, "it's not so bad." Morty made a sleepy sound of agreement. The clocks didn't tick. The rain didn't fall. Even gravity seemed to take a nap. And in that gentle pause and that endless, forgiving stillness, two travelers simply were, not saving, not escaping, not inventing, just existing inside a moment that no longer needed to move. There are moments so thin, so fragile that time itself forgets to carry them forward. They exist in a hush between seconds, in the pause before breath, in the soft exhale of memory when it no longer needs to be remembered. That was where Rick and Morty awoke, or maybe didn't awake at all. In the quiet place between the ticking of clocks. It wasn't darkness nor light. It was something softer, like the color of old paper, or the silence after a story ends. The air had weight but not gravity. The world had shape, but no edges. When Morty blinked, stars trembled like dust motes in sunlight. "Where are we?" he whispered. Rick looked around, squinting as though through fog. Nowhere, technically, but also, everywhere time took a breath. Morty frowned. That doesn't make any sense, Rick smirked. Good. It means you're paying attention. They were standing, if one could call it that, on a surface made of memory. Beneath their feet shimmered scenes from other lives, other loops. The garage, the rain, the hourglass, all faintly visible, like ripples reflected in mirrored water. Morty knelt, touching the surface. His fingers passed through light that felt both warm and cold. It's like the past is still here. It never left, Rick said softly. We just moved too fast to notice it. There was no horizon. Just the endless shimmer of moments stacked upon moments, like glass panes leaning on eternity. They could hear faint echoes, laughter, thunder, the murmur of words spoken long ago. And over it all the hum of stillness calm and ancient, like the deep breath of the universe asleep. Rick, Morty said after a while. I thought you said the loop ended. Rick tilted his head. Maybe it did. Maybe this is what's on the other side. Morty looked uneasy. So, what now? Are we like stuck here forever? Rick's gaze drifted to the infinite stillness around them. Do you ever notice how every loop starts the same way but ends a little quieter? Maybe this is the quietest it gets, the pause before everything begins again. Morty sighed. That sounds kinda lonely, Rick chuckled. Kid, everything worth understanding starts lonely. They began to walk, or rather to drift. The space around them responded like water to their movement, rippling outward, revealing fragments of their journey. The time Morty first built something without Rick's help. The time Rick looked at a sunrise and didn't rush to calculate its wavelength. The reflections weren't linear. They shimmered in patterns like constellations drawn by memory itself. Rick, yeah? Do you ever regret it, you know? All the running, all the loops, all the stuff you tried to fix but couldn't? Rick was silent for a long moment. The word regret seemed too small for the weight behind his eyes. Regret's a funny thing, he said finally. It's like gravity. You can fight it, but it always pulls you home. Morty frowned. So you do regret it? Rick's laugh was low and dry. Of course I do. But not for the reasons you think. I don't regret what I broke. I regret what I never slowed down enough to hold. They stopped near a place where the shimmer deepened, forming what looked like a window, or a mirror. Inside it, Morty saw himself years younger chasing Rick across galaxies, shouting with that mix of awe and fear only youth can hold. Rick reached out and touched the reflection. The image rippled, dissolving into golden dust. Every time I ran, Rick said, I told myself it was for discovery, but it was really just to stay ahead of stillness. I didn't know silence could be this forgiving. Morty glanced at him, unsure what to say. The stillness seemed to press gently against them, like an invisible hand resting over a racing heartbeat. What happens when we stop running? Morty asked quietly. Rick smiled. Not the sharp, sarcastic kind, but the tired, human one that carries warmth. We find out who we were trying to catch. They kept walking. The ground beneath them began to shift from light to mist, from mist to soft echoes. The air tasted faintly of static and rain. Each step dissolved into sound, not footsteps but gentle notes, like strings plucked from the fabric of existence. Morty tilted his head. Do you hear that? Rick nodded. Every universe has a pulse. We just never slow down enough to listen. The rhythm grew fainter, like a lullaby traveling from far away. It wasn't a song, not exactly. More like the idea of one, unfinished but full of meaning. Morty's eyes softened. It's beautiful. Rick closed his eyes. Yeah, it is. They stood in silence, breathing in the music of nothingness. After a while, Morty spoke again. You think this is it, Rick? Like the end? Rick opened his eyes. They glowed faintly with reflected starlight. Maybe. But maybe endings are just places we finally stop trying to measure. Morty kicked at the mist. You always have to make it sound complicated. Rick grinned. It's only complicated if you care about answers. Morty laughed softly, and for the first time it didn't echo. The sound was absorbed by the stillness, as if the world itself had taken it gently in its hands. Rick placed a hand on Morty's shoulder. You know what's funny? After everything, after all the universes, all the chaos, this might be the first place where I don't need to fix anything. Morty looked around, the light reflecting in his eyes. Maybe that's what it means to really stop time. Not to freeze it, but to stop needing to change it. Rick smiled. You're learning, kid. They both looked upward, if upward even existed there. The stars above them shimmered like grains of the hourglass, suspended mid-descent. Rick took a deep breath. Feels like time's waiting for us to say something before it moves again. Morty thought for a long while. Then maybe we don't say anything at all. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was rich, like soil that had finally been left to rest. Every memory, every regret, every fragment of who they'd been seemed to dissolve gently into the air. Not lost but softened, absorbed by something greater than both of them. Rick's eyes fluttered half shut. "You feel that?" Morty nodded. "Yeah. Everything's slowing down." Rick smiled faintly. "Good. Let it." The last grain of light in the unseen hourglass trembled, holding itself perfectly still. In that moment, there was no loop. No time, no past or future. Only the breath between them, the smallest possible infinity. And then, as softly as a sigh, everything began to fade, not away but inward, folding into the calm that comes when all questions have finally been asked. Rick whispered, barely audible, "Maybe this was the point all along." Morty leaned closer. "What was?" Rick's voice was fading. "To stop running before the next second finds us." Then the world exhaled, and the place between seconds became light. It began with a tremor, so small it could have been mistaken for a sigh. The air shifted first. That familiar shimmer, once smooth as silk, now wavered like candlelight at the end of its wick. The stillness that had held Rick and Morty in its gentle embrace began to pulse, as if the universe itself were breathing slower than usual, exhausted by eternity. Rick opened his eyes. The endless calm of the place between seconds was dimming. The stars, once bright and patient, had grown pale. Each one flickered uncertainly, as though unsure whether to stay or go. "Morty," Rick murmured, his voice roughened by silence. "You feel that?" Morty stirred beside him, still half asleep. His eyes glazed with the dreamlike peace that had settled over him for what could have been minutes or millennia. "Yeah," he said, rubbing his eyes. "It's like—" Everything's slowing down. Rick stood or tried to. The motion felt heavier than it should have, as though gravity had returned but only halfway, like a sleepy memory of itself. "Time's getting tired," he said almost to himself. "All that looping, all that stretching. Fate's finally catching up." Morty blinked up at him. "What happens when time gets tired?" Rick looked around at the fading horizon, the golden mist thinning, the soft hum of eternity lowering its pitch like a record running out of spin. "It rests," he said simply. He didn't sound afraid, just tender. The silence around them deepened, but it wasn't the crisp silence of paused moments anymore. It was thicker, heavier, filled with something that felt almost human, like the way quiet fills a room after someone you love has fallen asleep. Rick knelt by the ground, brushing his fingers across what used to be the shimmer of memory. It was dull now, cool beneath his hand as if the echoes had run out of breath. "Fair's funny," he muttered. "You spend your life trying to bend time to your will, and then one day it just decides to stop listening." Morty's voice came softly. "Maybe it's tired of being used." Rick smiled faintly, the corners of his mouth twitching. "You're starting to sound like one of my better hallucinations, kid." But there was no sting in the words, only a kind of weary pride. They began walking again, though neither knew where they were going. The path, if it could still be called that, was fading beneath their feet. Each step felt slower, heavier, as though every movement had to be negotiated with the air. The stars above flickered one by one, bowing out without ceremony. After what felt like hours, or maybe only moments, they reached what looked like the remnants of a familiar place, a broken shadow of the garage, suspended in the nothingness. The outlines of tables and shelves glimmered faintly, sketches of reality drawn in trembling light. The smell of old metal and coffee drifted faintly through the air. Morty stopped. "Is this home?" Rick studied it quietly. "Maybe. Or maybe time's just dreaming of it while it rests." They stepped inside. The hum of the fluorescent bulb above the workbench was faint, but still there. A small, tired sound like a lullaby humming itself to sleep. Rick sat down in his old chair. It creaked, the sound oddly alive in the fading world. For a long while he said nothing. He just stared at the empty desk, the cracked hourglass still there, its golden sand frozen mid-fall, suspended like a memory that refused to finish. Morty sat beside him, resting his chin in his hands. "It feels weird," he said softly. "Like the universe forgot how to breathe." Rick chuckled, a low, dry sound. Maybe it finally decided to take a nap. "Can't say I blame it." They sat in that half-light, surrounded by the gentle decay of everything that had once moved. Time no longer flowed. It drifted. It had grown soft around the edges, like the last few seconds of a dream. Rick reached out and touched the cracked glass of the hourglass. It was cold, almost lifeless, but inside the last few grains still shimmered faintly, suspended in their descent. He whispered to it, not out of science, but reverence. "You did good." Morty looked over. "You talking to time?" Rick smirked. Who else would listen? The joke hung in the air like a sigh, soft and honest. Outside us, if outside still existed, the golden light began to dim. Shadows melted into one another, dissolving into hues of deep blue and silver. The air felt thick with quiet. It wasn't frightening, just final. Rick leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. "Morty, you ever notice how the quietest things are always the hardest to hold on to?" Morty thought for a moment. "Yeah, it's like they slip away the second you stop trying to keep them." Rick nodded. "That's because they were never meant to be kept." Just felt. The hum above them flickered once, twice, then steadied, a soft heartbeat of light. Rick watched it, his eyes half-lidded, the lines on his face deeper but gentler than before. He looked less like a man who'd conquered the multiverse, and more like someone who'd finally learned to sit still inside it. Morty turned to him. "So what do we do now? Wait until it all stops?" Rick smiled faintly. "Maybe we don't do anything. Maybe we just let time sleep. Give it the peace it never gave us." Morty hesitated, then nodded. "Okay." The minutes, what passed for them, stretched out softly. No clocks ticked. No equations demanded solving. The universe was resting, and for once Rick let it. After a long silence, Morty spoke again, his voice barely more than a whisper. "You think it'll wake up?" Rick's eyes softened. "Everything wakes up eventually, Morty. Even the stars." Morty leaned his head against the desk, his eyes heavy. "Then maybe we should rest too." Rick didn't answer. He just reached over and adjusted the lamp so that its light fell gently across the hourglass. The last few grains still hung in the air, suspended in a dream. Outside, the fabric of reality pulsed one last time. A slow, weary heartbeat. Then, like a deep inhale after a long day, the entire cosmos seemed to settle into itself. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full of the echoes of everything that had ever been, folded neatly into rest. Rick's eyes closed halfway, his voice a murmur. "You did good, old man," he muttered. Though it wasn't clear whether he was talking to himself, to time, or to the universe, Morty's breathing evened out beside him. The hum of the lamp became softer, deeper, a rhythm that sounded almost like waves against a shore they hadn't yet reached. Rick tilted his head back, eyes glinting faintly. "Even silence gets tired," he whispered. "I guess it deserves to sleep too." And as he leaned back, the glow around the room dimmed into a warm twilight. The hourglass gave a faint shivering pulse, releasing one last grain of golden sand. It fell not downwards but inward, disappearing into its own stillness. The last sound before everything dissolved was Rick's soft laugh. Tired, gentle, at peace, and then for a long time, there was nothing but rest. Morty dreamed of light, not the bright, blinding kind that wakes you, but the slow, liquid kind that gathers under closed eyelids. It felt warm, familiar, like the hum of a lamp in a room that never quite gets dark. He was standing in the garage again. Only it wasn't the garage. The air shimmered like honey, thick with memory. Every surface glowed faintly, as if lit from within by the echoes of laughter, whispers, and clinking glass beakers that hadn't been touched in years. Rick was there too, hunched over his desk, but younger somehow. His back straighter, his movements quicker, like a reflection of who he'd been before all the loops, before the hourglass. "Hey, Rick," Morty said, though his voice came out softer than he intended, like the whisper of a thought instead of speech. Rick didn't answer. He didn't even look up. He was sketching something on a scrap of paper, a spiral of lines that looked like a clock melting into sand. Morty took a slow step forward, His feet made no sound. The world around him felt like it had been wrapped in cotton. Every motion left a small ripple of light in the air, like stars winking in and out of being. He peered over Rick's shoulder. On the paper, the spiral glowed faintly. In the center of it, Rick had written one word in uneven, trembling letters. Remember. Morty opened his mouth to ask what it meant, but before he could, Rick's hand froze. The pen rolled from his fingers and hit the table without a sound. The world flickered. When Morty blinked again, the garage was gone. He was in the diner now, that old midnight place that had once appeared in the loops. Only this time it was full of people. Familiar and unfamiliar faces filled the booths. 1,000 versions of themselves sitting side by side, all quiet, all peaceful. One Morty was stirring a cup of cocoa, staring dreamily into its swirls. Another sat by the window, chin on his palm, watching snow fall beyond the glass. There were Ricks too, dozens of them, some laughing softly, some just sitting with closed eyes, heads bowed in reflection. Morty walked through the diner, brushing past the memories. None of them looked at him, but he felt them. Small glimmers of what had been, laughter, fear, hope, forgiveness. Every table hummed with the ghost of a moment once lived and loved. At the far end of the diner sat his Rick, the one from now. Older, slower, softer around the eyes, he was sitting alone, a mug of coffee cooling beside him, watching the clock above the counter tick in lazy circles. "Rick?" Morty said. This time Rick looked up. His eyes were clear, not sharp, not wild, just still. "Hey, kid," he said, voice low. "You found the quiet part." Morty frowned, sliding into the seat across from him. "The what?" Rick gestured lazily toward the window. Outside, the stars hung unmoving in a velvet sky. Every dream's got a quiet part. The place where everything that mattered slows down long enough to say goodbye. Morty hesitated. "Goodbye?" Rick nodded slowly. "That's what time's been doing. It's not breaking, it's not ending. It's just saying goodnight." Morty stared into his reflection in the window. The diner lights glowed like halos across the glass. "So, what happens after?" Rick smiled faintly, the kind of smile that was more memory than expression. "After? You wake up. You remember the good parts. You let the rest drift." Morty lowered his gaze to his hands. They were trembling, not from fear, but from the strange tenderness of it all. "I don't want it to end," he whispered. "I like it here. It's quiet." Rick leaned back, his chair creaking softly. "Yeah," he said. "That's how I felt too. But even dreams get tired of being perfect. Sooner or later they ask you to wake up." The sound of the ticking clock grew louder, clearer. Morty turned toward it. The hands moved slower now, deliberate, gentle, like a heartbeat. "Rick," he said, "if this is a dream, what are you?" Rick tilted his head, smiling faintly. "Maybe I'm the part of you that still needs to hear things said out loud." Morty laughed, a small disbelieving sound. "That sounds like something you'd actually say." "Yeah," Rick said softly. "I guess some parts of me don't change, even in dreams." The two of them sat in silence, the diner stretching around them like a memory of peace. The smell of coffee, the hum of the jukebox that played no song, all of it held them like a lullaby. Outside the window, the snow began to fall upward, drifting toward the stars. Rick reached across the table, his hand hovering above the surface as though touching air itself. "You've done good, Morty," he said quietly. "Better than me most days." Morty's eyes stung. "So that's not true." Rick shook his head. "It's okay, kid. Dreams are where truth gets softer. Let it." The ticking slowed again. Morty looked up at the clock. It was still moving, but the space between each tick was growing wider, stretching into silence. Rick's form began to blur, not fade, just dissolve into light, the same way sand blurs when you touch it underwater. "Rick," Rick smiled gently. "When you wake up, tell time I said thanks." And then the diner melted into warmth. Morty was falling, or maybe floating. The light wrapped around him, curling like a blanket. He saw flashes, not of adventures, but of quiet things. A sandwich shared under a lamp. The sound of Beth's laughter. Her small glowing hourglass sitting forgotten on a desk. He saw himself sitting beside Rick, both of them breathing in the same rhythm as the world. And in that breath he realized none of it was gone. It was just resting. When he finally opened his eyes, the light was dim. He was back in the garage. The air was still golden, dust floating like slow snow. Rick's chair was empty. The lamp hummed faintly the way it always did, a heartbeat in the quiet. "Rick?" he called softly. No answer, but on the desk lay a folded scrap of paper. Morty reached out, his hands shaking as he unfolded it. Inside, written in Rick's uneven scrawl, was one line. "Everything that sleeps wakes softer." Morty stared at it until the letters blurred. Then he smiled, small, sad but warm. He leaned back in the chair, the hum of the lamp filling the room. Outside, the stars waited patiently. Inside, Morty closed his eyes again, holding on to that one soft truth. And for the first time in forever, he dreamed not of chaos or running or fear, but of stillness, a stillness that felt like home. The air was thin when Rick returned. It wasn't the cold kind of thin, not sharp or cruel, but the kind that feels like the world is exhaling after a long, unbroken breath. The garage was dim now, bathed in the sleepy gold of an unseen sun. Dust floated through the stillness, catching the light in slow spirals, and the hum of the old lamp pulsed like a heartbeat that had forgotten it once belonged to time. Morty had dozed off in the chair, a folded paper still resting loosely in his hand. The line Rick had written, "Everything that sleeps wakes softer," was creased but legible, glowing faintly in the half-light. Rick stood in the doorway for a long time, not moving. His coat hung heavier on him now, his silhouette softer, as though time itself had finally caught up, pressing gently against his shoulders. In his right hand he held the hourglass, cracked open like a fragile shell. The sand inside glowed faintly, leaking in soft streams that shimmered before disappearing into the air. Each step he took toward the desk made the floor whisper under his boots. The silence welcomed him. Morty stirred awake at the sound, blinking blearily. "Rick?" Rick gave a quiet nod, setting the hourglass down on the table between them. "Yeah, kid." "I'm here." Morty sat up, rubbing his eyes. When he saw the hourglass, his breath caught. "It's broken." Rick's voice was soft, the kind of soft that only comes when anger, pride, and fear have long since dissolved. "Yeah. It cracked when the loops started folding in on themselves. Guess it wasn't built for forever." Morty looked at the glowing fissures spreading across the glass. The sand inside pulsed faintly with light, each grain humming like a memory that still remembered how to breathe. "Can you fix it?" Rick gave a faint chuckle. "For once, Morty, I don't think it wants to be fixed." He ran a thumb across the broken edge and a wisp of gold rose into the air, swirling slowly before fading. "I think time's ready to stop pretending it needs us." Morty frowned, unsure. "So, what happens now?" Rick exhaled, long and slow. "Now we let it rest. We stop trying to rewind what was never meant to repeat." The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. For the first time in what felt like forever, Morty didn't try to answer. He just listened. Rick sat down across from him, their chairs creaking in unison. Between them, the cracked hourglass continued to glow softly, its light reflecting in their tired eyes. The silence stretched, not awkward but sacred, the kind of silence you don't break because you finally understand it's speaking for you. Morty leaned forward. "When did you know that it was over?" Rick looked at the hourglass again. "When I realized I couldn't remember which moment was the first." He smiled faintly, almost apologetically. Every loop, every reset, it all started feeling like the same song played too slow. Even the silence started to sound familiar. Morty tilted his head, thinking. "And you weren't scared?" Rick's eyes softened. "I used to be scared of running out of time, Morty. Then I realized that time's been scared of running out of me." Morty blinked. "What does that mean?" Rick shrugged. "It means maybe we were both tired. Me and time. Maybe it's okay for both of us to stop trying to fix each other." The hourglass gave a quiet pop, and a thin fracture spread from top to bottom. A slow trickle of golden sand spilled out, pooling on the desk. It didn't fall like normal sand. It drifted sideways, as though remembering another kind of gravity. Morty reached out, cupping his hands beneath it. The grains gathered in his palms, weightless and warm, each one glowing faintly. He held them carefully, like holding light. "What do we do with it?" he asked. Rick studied the sand, his expression unreadable. "We let it go." Morty hesitated. "Just like that?" Rick nodded. "Just like that." The boy looked down at the shimmering pile. It pulsed faintly with their shared memories, laughter, silence, stars, sandwiches at midnight. Every adventure, every regret, every small kindness lived inside that quiet glow. He wanted to keep it, to hold it forever. But the warmth in his palms began to fade, and instinct told him holding on would only make it hurt. He exhaled softly and opened his hands. The golden sand drifted upward, scattering like dandelion seeds caught in a slow wind. It filled the room with light, brushing against their faces, their hair, their eyes. For a moment, the garage shimmered like a constellation breathing. Rick tilted his head back, watching the grains rise. "You ever notice," he said, "how everything looks a little more beautiful when it knows it's about to end?" Morty didn't answer. He was too busy watching the last few grains lift off his fingertips, glowing faintly before disappearing into the air. When the last of the light faded, the room felt heavier again. Not sad, not empty, just real. The hum of the lamp returned. The faint tick of something distant echoed softly, like the memory of a heartbeat rediscovering rhythm. Rick leaned forward, elbows on his knees, his voice barely above a whisper. "You did good, kid." Morty looked at him, confused. "What did I do?" Rick gave a tired smile. "You stayed." They sat together in the quiet for a long while, the golden dust still faintly glittering on their sleeves. Rick reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small scrap of paper. It was old, folded and refolded, edges frayed from years of forgetting. He unfolded it slowly, revealing a faded drawing, a child's sketch of a rocket ship and two stick figures standing beneath it, one taller than the other. "Beth drew this when she was 6, Rick said, his voice soft, distant. "Said it was us, taking off for somewhere better. Guess I never realized we'd already made it there once." Morty looked at the paper, then at him. "You still could, you know. Go somewhere better." Rick smiled faintly, eyes glimmering. "Maybe I already have." A faint crack echoed through the room. The hourglass had split entirely now, its halves falling gently apart. Inside, nothing was left, just a hollow shimmer where time had once rested. Rick brushed a hand across the fragments, his voice barely audible. "Guess that's it, huh?" Morty nodded. The last reset. The words felt final but kind, like closing a book whose ending you finally understand. Rick leaned back, sighing. "Yeah, the last one." Outside, the stars shifted slightly. It was the smallest movement, but it was enough. The first sign that the loops had truly ended. Time at last had started breathing again. Rick closed his eyes, his tone almost a whisper. "It's okay now, Morty. No more loops. No more waiting." Morty leaned back beside him, his eyelids heavy. "So what do we do now?" Rick smiled faintly, the light from the desk lamp tracing soft lines across his face. "Now, kid, we rest." And for the first time in an eternity, they did. The lamp hummed quietly, the dust settled, and the broken hourglass lay still, no longer glowing, no longer weeping light but at peace. The last grain of time had fallen, and all it left behind was silence, a silence that sounded a lot like home. The dawn that followed was unlike any the universe had seen in a long, long time. It arrived without fanfare, without the slow bleeding of stars into color, just a hush, a trembling quiet, and then light. A clean, unbroken light that slipped between the ruins of forgotten clocks and scattered their shadows into something tender. For the first time in what felt like forever, time moved, not rushed, not stumbled, just moved, like a cautious creature testing the ground after a storm. The galaxies, once suspended like thoughts half remembered, began their patient turning. Worlds that had been paused mid-breath exhaled again, letting seasons thaw and rivers remember their names. And somewhere small in all that vastness, inside a garage that had forgotten its own age, Rick and Morty woke to the hum of something real. Morty was the first to stir. The light touched his face, warm and golden, slipping past the crooked blinds and painting faint lines across his cheek. For a heartbeat, he didn't recognize it. The air smelled different, cleaner somehow, softer. The kind of air that belongs to beginnings. Rick was still at the desk, his head resting on folded arms beside the shattered hourglass. The lamp had burned itself out sometime during the night, leaving only the faint shimmer of dawn. Morty looked at him for a moment, not the way you look at a scientist or a grandfather or even a legend, but the way you look at someone who's finally stopped running. The silence was fragile. He didn't want to break it, but life has always had its own quiet persistence. "Rick?" Morty's voice was barely more than a whisper. Rick didn't move at first, just grunted, a low, almost amused sound. If you're about to tell me it's morning, kid, I'm gonna need coffee strong enough to bend gravity. Morty smiled faintly. The normalcy of it felt strange. Good strange. It's more than morning, Rick. It's different. Rick sat up slowly, blinking against the light. His hair was wild, his eyes bloodshot, but there was something new in them. Or maybe something old that had been waiting to return. He followed Morty's gaze toward the window. Outside, the sky wasn't blue or gold or pink. It was everything at once. Layers of color folding into each other, alive with motion. The clouds moved like they'd been set free from stillness itself. Rick squinted. Well, I'll be damned. Time actually kept its promise. He stood, stretching with a groan that sounded halfway between exhaustion and disbelief. Feels weird, doesn't it? No ticking, no loops, no déjà vu. Just forward. Morty nodded. Yeah, it's like the universe woke up. Rick chuckled quietly. Guess that makes us its alarm clock. They stepped outside, blinking at the brightness. The ground felt different. Not heavier or lighter, just real. The breeze carried with it faint sounds. Leaves shifting, birds murmuring. The low hum of something alive again. For a long while, they said nothing. Rick walked toward the edge of the yard, hands in his coat pockets. He stared out at the horizon where the sky curved softly into infinity. You know, he said finally, when I built that hourglass, I thought I was saving time. Turns out all I did was trap it. Morty looked up at him. You mean the loops? Rick nodded. Every reset, every second chance, I told myself I was fixing things. But really, I was just afraid to let go. Afraid to let things end. Morty kicked at a pebble, thinking, I guess that's what everyone does, right? Try to keep stuff from ending. Rick smirked. Yeah, but the thing about endings, Morty, is that they're what make the middle parts worth remembering. A faint silence followed, filled only by the rustle of wind through the grass. Morty's gaze wandered to a small patch of earth near the old workbench. Something green had started to grow there, a single sprout pushing through the dirt. It caught the light like it had been waiting all along for this exact morning. He crouched beside it. Look, it's growing. Rick leaned over, studying it with mock seriousness. Didn't think anything could survive my garage. Morty smiled. Maybe it couldn't before. But now... Rick tilted his head. Now time's moving again. They watched it for a while, the tiny thing swaying in the breeze. Then Rick said, half to himself, funny. The universe resets, and the first thing it does is grow something small. Guess that's its way of saying it's okay to start over. Morty stood. So what happens to us now? Rick looked at him, his expression unreadable but softer than usual. Now we live with it. Maybe even let it surprise us. Morty hesitated. No more hourglass? Rick chuckled. Time's earned its freedom. So have we. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the tiny remnant of golden dust he'd kept, the last grain that hadn't scattered. It glowed faintly, pulsing like a slow heartbeat. Guess it's not mine to keep, he murmured. Morty watched as Rick let it fall from his fingers. The grain drifted on the breeze, glinting once before dissolving completely. And just like that, it was gone. But something shifted when it vanished. Not outside, but within. The air felt warmer. The light seemed to breathe deeper. Somewhere unseen, a clock began to tick. Slow, steady, new. Rick exhaled, the sound carrying a quiet relief. There it is, Morty frowned. What? Rick smiled faintly. The first second of the rest of everything. They walked down the hill together, the light behind them spilling over the horizon. The wind carried the faint scent of rain and electricity, like the earth remembering its own heartbeat. At the base of the hill, Morty glanced back. The garage looked smaller from here, less like a lab, more like a relic from a story that had already told itself. He thought about the loops, the stars, the silence that had stretched across eternities. Rick? Yeah? Do you think time forgives? Rick paused, thinking. Then, after a long silence, he said quietly, I think it forgets, Morty. And that's close enough. They kept walking. The path wound between fields of tall grass that swayed like waves. Above them, the sky deepened into a radiant blue, and flocks of unseen birds traced invisible maps through it. Every sound, every flicker of wind, felt like a promise being kept. Rick stopped once more and looked up. You hear that? Morty listened. What? Rick smiled. Nothing. No echoes, no loops, no ticking ghosts. Just life. The words lingered, weightless but true. They reached the old fence line and stood there, looking out at the endless stretch ahead, mountains, clouds, light. A world that had no memory of what it had lost, only what it could become. Morty's eyes shimmered as he whispered, "It's beautiful." Rick nodded. "Yeah, kid, for once. It really is." And so they stood, two silhouettes against a dawn that no longer remembered the dark. The loops were gone. The clocks were quiet. Time, at last, was alive again and moving forward, gentle and infinite, carrying them with it into the soft hum of whatever came next. It was evening again, not the kind that comes rushing in with the weight of a day's end, but the soft kind that drifts down like dust in golden light. The world had begun to grow its rhythm back, slow and uncertain, like a song rediscovering its melody after a long silence. Rick and Morty sat outside the garage beneath a half-finished sky. The sun was still learning how to set again. Its colors seemed unsure, pooling lazily between pink and amber. The air had that sleepy warmth that comes just before the stars are brave enough to appear. The ground where Morty had buried the shards of the hourglass glowed faintly now. Each fragment pulsed beneath the soil, small breaths of light rising and falling. By night they looked like constellations that had fallen to earth, quiet, patient, eternal. Rick leaned back against a rusted chair, his eyes half closed. A mug of something hot steamed in his hands, though he hadn't taken a sip in a while. Morty lay on his back in the grass, tracing the faint lights beneath him with his finger. Neither of them had spoken for a long time. When Rick finally did, his voice was softer than the air around them. "You know, kid, I think time's starting to trust us again." Morty turned his head. "How do you mean?" Rick gestured vaguely toward the sky. "All this. It's moving again, but slow. Like it's watching us, making sure we don't break it this time." Morty smiled faintly. "We won't." Rick huffed a quiet, almost tired laugh. "You sound pretty sure for someone who's seen me dismantle the multiverse over coffee." "Yeah," Morty said, eyes on the glowing dirt. "But you fixed it too." Rick didn't reply. The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was full of all the things that didn't need to be said. Beyond the fence, the night began to bloom. Crickets tuned their instruments. The wind rehearsed a lullaby through the trees. The lights beneath the soil shimmered brighter, reflecting faintly in Rick's eyes. "Do you think it remembers?" Morty asked suddenly. "The hourglass, I mean. The loops, the worlds we saw." Rick shrugged. "Maybe. Maybe it doesn't need to. Maybe remembering isn't about keeping things. Maybe it's about knowing what they meant." Morty thought about that. "So, like feelings instead of facts." Rick smirked. "Yeah, feelings stick better anyway." They sat quietly for a while longer. Somewhere in the distance, a faint hum rose and fell. Maybe a ship, maybe just the wind learning to sing again. Rick looked out at the field, his voice low. "I used to think time was this big thing, a system, something to measure, to control, to hack. But it's really just a collection of small kindnesses, stretched thin across infinity." Morty blinked. "Small kindnesses?" Rick nodded. "Moments where you pause, smile, breathe, when you listen instead of talk. Those are the real seconds, Morty. The rest is noise." The words hung there, soft and shimmering. Morty whispered, "Then, I guess we wasted a lot of time." Rick shook his head. "Nah, we just didn't notice it passing." "That's not waste. That's just living before you know how." A faint breeze passed between them. The sky deepened into indigo, and the stars began to wake. First one, then another, then all of them, spreading like scattered memory across the canvas of night. Morty sat up. "Rick, look." Rick followed his gaze. Above them, the stars weren't quite the same as before. Some pulsed with the same faint gold as the buried shards. Others seemed to flicker in rhythm with their heartbeat. It was as if the universe itself was remembering them back. Morty's breath caught. "They look like—" "Yeah," Rick murmured. "Loops, but these weren't the endless heavy loops of before. They were gentle, shimmering circles, not traps, but reminders." Time had learned to bend without breaking. Rick stood, brushing off his coat. "Come on, Morty. There's something I want to show you." They walked down the dirt road past the flickering fence and the silent fields. The air grew cooler, filled with that deep stillness that only exists when the world is both awake and dreaming. At the crest of the hill stood the old observatory, or rather, what was left of it. The roof had caved slightly, and vines curled around the telescope like it had grown roots. But the glass still gleamed, and the stars still answered when they looked through. Rick knelt, adjusting the scope with careful, deliberate movements. He said nothing as he peered through it, only exhaled slowly. Then he motioned for Morty. "Go on, take a look." Morty leaned in. The view wasn't like before. No flashing universes, no tangled possibilities, just a single vast image of the night sky reflected endlessly upon itself. Each layer softer than the last, fading into gold. He blinked. "It's us," Rick smiled faintly. "Not us exactly, just all the moments we didn't lose." Morty looked again and saw flashes of memory woven into the starlight, a sandwich under a lamp, the hum of the garage, laughter that never made it to daylight. The first time Rick called him kid without irritation. A night when time fell silent, and they listened instead of running. Every memory was small, none of them were extraordinary. But together they felt infinite. Morty stepped back, tears glinting. "I didn't know time could look like that." Rick placed a hand on his shoulder, firm and steady. "That's 'cause it doesn't. We just made it remember." They stood there for a while, neither moving, just breathing. The observatory hummed faintly around them, as if the walls themselves remembered the echoes of laughter that had once filled the space. Finally, Morty whispered, "So what now?" Rick's answer came slow, quiet. "Reverend, now we live it once, and that'll be enough." They started back toward the garage. The stars followed them home. At the door, Morty looked over his shoulder one last time. The observatory lights flickered faintly in the distance, fading into the dark. "Hey, Rick, yeah?" "Thanks." Rick didn't turn around. "For what?" Morty smiled. "For remembering with me." Rick paused. His voice was almost lost to the wind when he said, "Always, kid." Inside the garage, the light was soft again, the kind that belongs to endings that don't quite end. Rick sat at the desk and pulled a small notebook closer. On its first page he wrote in uneven handwriting, "Tonight, the stars remembered us." He closed it gently, as if sealing a promise. Outside, the shards beneath the soil glowed brighter, their light blending with the stars above until the two became indistinguishable, heaven and earth remembering each other in silence. And somewhere between them, between the tick of 1 second and the next, time smiled. The night stretched wide and endless, quiet as breath. The world had stopped shimmering, yet it glowed from within, a low hum in the bones of everything, like the universe had exhaled for the first time in forever. Rick sat in his chair, head tilted back, eyes half closed. The lamp above him gave off a soft amber light, barely flickering, its warmth gathering gently on his face. Beside him, Morty rested on the couch with a blanket wrapped around his shoulders, his hair still a mess from the long walk back from the hill. The garage was peaceful again. Tools lay scattered where they'd always been. The same half-built gadgets hummed faintly, unsure if they should wake or sleep. But the air was different, heavier, slower, the kind of air that fills a room after rain or forgiveness. For the first time in a long time, the clocks had begun ticking again, not sharply, not with the arrogant precision of machines, but softly, each tick like a heartbeat half a world away. Rick listened to them. He didn't speak, didn't think, didn't build. He just listened. The golden dust Morty had buried beneath the soil outside had begun to drift again, tiny particles lifting into the air, invisible except when they passed through the lamplight. The faint shimmer floated through the open window, moving lazily like dreams that hadn't yet chosen who to belong to. Morty stirred, his voice small, half asleep. "Rick, you still up?" Rick smiled faintly without opening his eyes. "Define up, kid," Morty yawned. "I don't know. Awake, I guess." Rick let out a low hum. "Then maybe not. Maybe I'm just remembering how to be here." Morty blinked groggily. "You mean like not stuck in loops anymore?" Rick opened one eye, looking toward the window, where the faint night breeze stirred the curtain. "Yeah, just this moment. This exact second. That's all there ever was anyway. We just kept running circles inside it. The clocks kept ticking and soft, patient, forgiving. Morty watched the dust drift near the light. "It's weird," he murmured. "Feels like everything's the same, but also not." Rick turned his head. "That's what happens when time heals. It doesn't change things. It just makes them gentle." The words hung in the air, warm and heavy, Outside, the sky had begun to turn silver, that delicate, uncertain hour when night isn't sure if it wants to stay. The stars shimmered faintly, their reflections glowing softly in the glass jars Rick had left on the workbench. Each jar held a piece of something forgotten, a screw, a bit of wire, a folded napkin with numbers written in ink. But now they looked like memories, tiny worlds preserved in stillness. Rick's hand drifted toward one of them, a small jar with a single grain of gold at the bottom. The last echo of the hourglass. He turned it slowly in his palm, watching the way the light caught it. Morty's eyes followed. "You kept one?" Rick shrugged. "Didn't mean to. Guess it wanted to stay." Morty smiled faintly. "You gonna use it?" Rick shook his head. "Nah. Some things are meant to be seen, not fixed." He placed the jar on the shelf beside an old photo of him and Beth. She was maybe 8, holding a homemade telescope made from cardboard. The edges of the picture had faded, but the memory inside hadn't. The light from the lamp reflected softly off the glass, joining the gold in a single shimmer. For a long while, neither spoke. Then Morty, his voice small, said, "Do you think we'll ever go back out there? You know, into the big stuff?" Rick leaned back, staring at the ceiling, where a faint spiderweb caught the lamplight. "Maybe someday, but right now, the big stuff can wait. The universe doesn't need us to chase it anymore." Morty smiled sleepily. "Guess it never did." Rick chuckled softly. "Guess not." A faint rain began to fall outside, barely a whisper, just the soft tapping of drops on the tin roof. Each sound blended with the ticking clocks until the two became inseparable, the rhythm of time, the rhythm of rain. Rick's eyelids grew heavy. The weight of years and of loops and laughter and quiet failures settled around him, not as burden but as warmth. He thought about everything that had passed, the worlds frozen in sunset, the echoes of laughter, the hourglass cracking open like a sigh. And through it all, one feeling remained, not regret, not pride, but peace. The kind of peace that doesn't need to be understood to be real. Morty's breathing slowed beside him, his blanket rising and falling. He mumbled something in his sleep, something soft about stars or sandwiches or maybe both. Rick smiled faintly. He reached over and adjusted the lamp, dimming it until the room was all shadow and amber. The glow of the rain outside painted ripples across the floor. For a moment, Rick thought he heard the hum of the old portal gun. But when he turned, it was only the sound of the world breathing. He closed his eyes, and in the dark, he felt it, the faint vibration of everything moving again. Time no longer a loop or a burden, but a current, something that didn't drag or rush. It simply carried. Rick let it carry him. Images drifted softly through his half-dreaming mind. A clock melting into sand. A boy's laughter caught between seconds. The shimmer of gold spilling through his fingers. Beth's voice saying, "Thought you were there." And the sound, always the sound, of the garage light humming like a heartbeat that never really stopped. He wondered if maybe that was the secret all along. Not to escape time, but to listen to it. To let it speak in quiet moments. To let it forgive what it had seen. The ticking softened. The rain slowed. The night leaned closer, like it wanted to hear his final thought. Rick whispered it into the stillness. Maybe forever was just another word for now. His hand slipped from the armrest. His breath evened. The lamp's glow flickered once, then steadied, soft and eternal. Outside, the rain became mist, and the stars appeared again, faint but countless, breathing light into the clouds. The shards buried in the soil pulsed one last time before dimming, not vanishing, but becoming part of the earth itself. And then the clocks, all of them, began ticking together, not loudly, not sharply, but like lullabies, each second folding into the next, each moment blending into something endless. Morty stirred once more, opening his eyes just long enough to see the soft rise and fall of Rick's chest. He smiled, half dreaming. "Night, Rick." No answer, just the faint hum of peace. The room filled with the golden rhythm of the world continuing, steady, kind endless and somewhere far away. Maybe in the space between seconds, maybe in the silence behind it all. A voice, or the idea of one, seemed to whisper, and in the quiet between stars, he finally understood. The light dimmed. The world exhaled. The sand kept falling. "Thanks for spending this time with us." Sleep well. Everything's going to be okay, man.